I had spent months preparing for this climb. At 69 years old, I wasn't as fast as I used to be, but I was strong. My body had carried me through a lifetime of hikes, climbs, and trails that had tested my endurance. Mount Shasta was supposed to be another challenge, another story to tell. We started our ascent in the early morning, the sun just beginning to stretch across the sky. My friends, Bill and Jim, walked ahead at a steady pace while I took my time, focusing on my breathing. The air was thinner up here, sharp and crisp. I had been feeling a little off since the day before, lightheaded, sluggish, but I chalked it up to altitude. I wasn't going to let it slow me down. The trail wound upward, narrow and rocky, bordered by towering pines that whispered in the wind. I kept my eyes on my friends' backs as they climbed ahead. The gap between us widened, but it didn't worry me. They knew I liked to take my time. Then they disappeared over the ridge. I paused, catching my breath. My heart pounded harder than usual, my skin damp with sweat despite the cold. The wind picked up, sweeping over the mountainside in hollow gusts. That's when I heard it. A rustling. Faint but distinct. Something moving behind me. I turned. Nothing. Just the trees standing motionless, their dark trunks stretching toward the sky. The air was heavy with the scent of pine, but something else lingered beneath it. An odd, earthy musk that I couldn't place. I shook off the unease and kept walking. The path climbed higher, narrowing to a steep ridge with a sheer drop on one side. My legs felt like lead. Every step seemed harder than it should have been. A sharp pain lanced through my temples. My vision swam for a second, and I reached out to steady myself against a boulder. Altitude sickness. I cursed under my breath. I should have stopped earlier, should have listened to my body. But I was so close to the next waypoint. I could rest there. I pushed forward, one slow step at a time. My breath rasped in my throat. Then the silence fell. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but something deeper. Wrong. No wind. No birds. Even my own footsteps seemed swallowed by the stillness. A deep unease settled in my gut. I glanced behind me again. The trail stretched empty, disappearing into the trees below. My friends should have been visible by now, even if they had gone ahead. But there was nothing. The sky had darkened. Not from clouds, just a sudden, eerie dimness. As if the world had shifted ever so slightly. Then, the noise came back. A soft crunch. Not from my own steps. Something was behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly lost my balance. The trail was empty. But I wasn't alone. I couldn't see it. Couldn't hear it. But I felt it. Something was watching me. My pulse hammered against my ribs. I forced myself to keep moving, quickening my pace. My legs burned, but I ignored the pain. Then the world shifted. I blinked. The trail wasn't where it should have been. It was different. Subtly at first, the rocks looked slightly off, the slope steeper than I remembered. The trees ahead weren't the same ones I had passed earlier. I stopped, swallowing hard. Had I taken a wrong turn? No, that wasn't possible. The trail was straightforward. Panic scratched at the edges of my mind. I tried to retrace my steps, but the path behind me was gone. The ridge I had climbed minutes ago had vanished. The trees weren't right. The air was different. I was somewhere else. I don't remember how long I stood there, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind fought to make sense of what I was seeing. I wasn't lost. I couldn't be. But the terrain said otherwise. I forced myself to move. If I could keep heading down, I'd find the main trail again. I had to, but every step felt wrong. The ground beneath my boots was softer than it should have been, like walking on a thick carpet of moss. The trees grew closer together, their branches arching overhead, blotting out the sky. The air smelled strange, earthy, damp, tinged with something metallic. I walked for what felt like hours, but nothing changed. No trail, no landmarks, just an endless stretch of trees and silence. Then I saw it, a shape, barely visible through the dense foliage. It was human-sized, standing still, just out of focus. My heart lurched. "Hey!" My voice came out hoarse, cracking from thirst. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, then another. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Tall, thin, the color of ash. Its head tilted slightly, as if listening. Every instinct screamed at me to run. I turned and bolted. Branches tore at my arms as I crashed through the undergrowth, my breath ragged. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The silence was back. That awful, unnatural silence. Then, a whisper. So close, right behind me. I stumbled, hit the ground hard, gasping as the air was knocked from my lungs. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I don't know how long I kept walking. Time had lost meaning. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. Thirst burned my throat. My limbs felt like dead weight. I needed to find water, shelter, anything. Then I saw it. A cabin, old, weathered, half hidden in the trees. I staggered toward it, my vision swimming. The door was slightly ajar. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Rot. Something long dead. The floor was covered in old, brittle leaves. The walls were scarred with deep scratches. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair. And on it, my backpack. The same one I had been carrying. The same one that had been on my shoulders when I started this hike. It was neatly placed on the chair, as if someone had been waiting for me to find it. I backed away, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, from the doorway, I heard it. A soft, rasping breath. I turned, and the last thing I saw was a pair of dark, empty eyes staring back at me. Carl Landers was never found. His body was never recovered. Only his footprints were found, leading into the woods, but never coming out. It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. Father and son. Just us. I had planned this trip for months, checking maps, preparing gear, making sure everything was set for our camping adventure in the Great Smoky Mountains. My boy, Dennis, was excited from the moment I told him. His small hands gripped mine tightly as we set off that morning, the weight of his backpack almost comically oversized on his small frame. We arrived at Spence Field, a clearing nestled deep in the wilderness, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush. The air was fresh, cool despite the warmth of summer, and the distant call of birds filled the silence between the rustling leaves. Dennis was 6, full of energy, his laughter bouncing between the trees as he ran ahead. It had been a long time since I had seen him so happy. The past year had been rough. Work kept me away more than I liked, and I promised myself I'd make up for it with this trip. A moment just for us. By late afternoon, we set up camp near another family, the Martins, who had a boy Dennis's age. They hit it off immediately, chasing each other through the clearing, laughing and tumbling like puppies. I remember sitting by the fire, watching him play. His bright red shirt made him easy to spot as he darted between the trees, his small form a flash of color against the deep green of the forest. I should have never looked away. It was a simple game. Hide and seek. Dennis, his new friend, and a few other kids decided to play before dinner. I could hear their giggles as they ran into the trees, their small figures darting between the trunks, hiding behind the thick brush. I watched for a while, smiling. It reminded me of my own childhood, of simpler days when the woods were just a playground, not a place of fear. Then the laughter stopped. Silence. That deep, thick silence that doesn't belong in a forest. I stood, scanning the trees. Dennis. No answer. I called again, my voice louder. My heart beat a little faster. No response. I walked toward the trees, trying to stay calm. Maybe he had found a good hiding spot. Maybe he was just waiting for someone to find him. All right, game's over, buddy. Come on out. Nothing. My breath came shorter. The other kids had already returned, their faces curious, but Dennis was nowhere in sight. I ran deeper into the woods, calling his name. Still nothing. That was when the fear set in. I searched for hours. Night came, cold and empty. I yelled until my throat burned, until my voice cracked and the darkness swallowed my words. The others helped. The whole camp was out there with flashlights, their beams flickering between the trees, searching, calling. But the forest gave nothing back. It was as if he had simply vanished. I refused to sleep. I walked through the night, my flashlight trembling in my grip, my legs aching. I told myself he had just wandered too far, that I would find him curled up under a tree, asleep, waiting for me. But I knew better. Something was wrong. I found his footprints in the soft dirt. Small, clear. They led off the main trail, deeper into the woods. I followed them. Then they stopped. Abruptly. No sign of struggle. No scuff marks. Just gone. As if he had been lifted straight off the ground. I stared at the earth, my breath coming in short gasps. My mind refused to accept it. There had to be something I missed. But there was nothing. Just silence. And the overwhelming feeling that I was not alone. Morning came with no answers. The search party grew, rangers joining the effort. Dogs were brought in, their noses to the ground, sniffing for any trace of my boy. They found nothing. No scent. No tracks. As if Dennis had never been there at all. But I knew better. I heard the whispers in the night. I saw the shapes moving between the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Something was out there. Something had taken my son. That evening, I spoke to an old hiker who had been in the area before the search started. He had been on the ridge just a few miles from our camp when he saw something. Someone moving along the tree line. A figure. Tall. Thin. Moving with an unnatural stillness. And beside it, a small shape. A child. A child in a red shirt. I didn't sleep. I waited until the search team spread out in another direction. Then I took my flashlight and walked alone into the woods. I followed my gut. The trees grew denser. The ground was uneven, covered in thick moss. The deeper I went, the heavier the air became, thick with moisture, tinged with something rotten. I kept walking. Then I heard it. A whisper. Low. Indistinct. A voice just beyond my understanding. I froze. The beam of my flashlight flickered, dimming for a moment before stabilizing. I wasn't alone. Something moved between the trees. I turned sharply, my breath catching in my throat. My flashlight swept across the trunks, the underbrush, the darkness beyond. Then, for just a second, I saw him, Dennis, standing motionless between the trees. His red shirt was dirty, torn. His face was pale, his wide eyes staring at me. But something was wrong. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. A lump formed in my throat. Dennis. I stepped forward, his head tilted slightly, his mouth opening. And then, before I could reach him, he vanished. Gone. The forest was empty again. The whispering returned. Closer. Surrounding me. I turned and ran. Branches tore at my clothes, my boots slipping on the damp earth. I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The whispering followed, growing louder, until I reached camp, gasping for breath, my mind spinning. Dennis was gone, and something had taken him. The search went on for weeks. No trace. No evidence. The rangers called it an unsolved disappearance. But I knew better. I never stopped searching. Every night, I returned to those woods. Listening. Watching. Waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear the whispers. And I know, Dennis is still out there. Somewhere. I never thought a simple hunting trip would change my life forever. It was supposed to be just another outing with the guys. 4 of us, all close friends, heading out to a remote area of the Adirondacks. We had hunted these woods for years, knew every trail, every ridge, every quiet clearing where deer liked to graze. That morning, the air was crisp, cold biting at my cheeks as we loaded up our rifles and gear. Tom, the oldest in our group, was in his 80s, but he still had the sharp eyes of a hunter. He had served in the military, seen his share of danger, but nothing ever seemed to shake him. We parked near Lily Pond and split up. Tom and I took the northern section while the others spread out further down. Our plan was simple. Tom would wait along a ridgeline while I circled back, driving deer toward him. I left him there, seated against a thick oak tree, his rifle resting across his lap. "Give me 2 hours," I told him. He nodded. "I'll be right here." Those were the last words I ever heard him say. I trekked through the woods, moving slow, careful not to make too much noise. The trees were tall, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. It should have been a good hunt, but the forest was too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant crack of twigs under a deer's hooves. Just silence. I felt it in my gut. Something was wrong. I picked up my pace, circling back toward Tom's position. My boots crunched through frost-covered leaves, my breath visible in the cold air. When I reached the ridge, he was gone. His rifle was still there, leaning against the tree. But Tom was nowhere to be seen. I called out. No answer. I searched the ground for tracks. His footprints were there, leading toward the tree where he had been sitting. But that was it. No scuffle. No signs of struggle. As if he had just vanished. Panic set in fast. I radioed the others. Within minutes, we were all there, standing by that lonely oak tree, staring at the empty space where Tom should have been. "He wouldn't just wander off," one of the guys said. I nodded. Tom had bad knees. He wouldn't have gone far without telling us. We spread out, calling his name, searching the area. Nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed him whole. By nightfall, we had no choice but to head back to the trucks and call for help. But even as we drove toward the nearest town, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had made a mistake, that we should have never left those woods. The next morning, the search teams arrived. Dozens of volunteers, state troopers, even helicopters scouring the area. The scent dogs were brought in, their noses to the ground, tails wagging as they picked up on his trail. For a while we had hope. Then, after just 20 yards, the dogs stopped. They circled the same spot, whining, confused. No scent beyond that point. One of the handlers frowned, adjusting the dog's harness. It's like he just disappeared. The words sent a chill down my spine. People don't just disappear. Not like this. The search continued, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping through my bones. That second night, as I lay awake in my tent, I heard something. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then, a whisper. Soft, indistinct, coming from the woods. I sat up, my breath frozen in my throat. The whispering grew louder, weaving through the trees, just beyond the reach of our campfire's glow. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The others were still asleep, unaware. I swept the beam across the tree line. Nothing. Then, just for a second, I saw something move. A shape. Tall. Thin. Standing too still. Watching. I opened my mouth to call out, but before I could, it was gone. The woods fell silent again. I didn't sleep after that. By the third day, hope had started to fade. The troopers expanded their search grid, but still, no sign of Tom. Then, just before dusk, a deputy radioed in. We found something. We raced to the site, our boots pounding through the frozen brush. It was a single item. Tom's walkie-talkie. It was lying in the dirt, undamaged, as if it had been placed there on purpose. I grabbed it, pressing the button. Static. Then, just as I was about to lower it, a sound crackled through. Breathing. Shallow. Ragged. Then a voice. Weak. Far away. Help. My blood ran cold. I pressed the button. Tom, where are you? Silence. Then, a whisper. Low. Indistinct. Close. Too close. Right behind me. I spun, my heart hammering. The forest was empty. The others saw the look on my face. What is it? I couldn't answer, because I knew deep in my gut. We weren't alone. The search was called off after a week. No body. No tracks. No answers. Tom Messick was gone, but I couldn't let it go. I returned to those woods, night after night, searching, listening. And every time, without fail, I heard the whispers. Soft. Calling. Leading me deeper. I never followed. Not after that last night, when I saw something standing between the trees. Tall. Thin. Waiting. And I knew, if I stepped too far into that darkness, I would never come back. Just like Tom. I never should have gone off trail. That thought stayed with me, whispering in the back of my mind, long after everything had gone wrong. It started as a simple solo hiking trip. 3 days, 2 nights, deep in the heart of an old-growth forest. The kind of place where the trees grew so thick you barely saw the sky, where the undergrowth swallowed sound, and where the world outside felt like a distant dream. I had planned this trip for months, mapped out my route, packed light but smart, prepared for everything. Or so I thought. The first day was easy. The trail was well-worn, winding through towering pines and dense thickets of ferns. I made good time, covering nearly 10 miles before setting up camp near a slow-moving creek. As I sat by my small fire, eating a protein bar and listening to the gentle trickle of water, I felt at peace. I should have enjoyed that moment more, because by the next morning, everything would change. I woke before dawn, packed up my gear, and started hiking. The plan was simple. Follow the main trail for another 5 miles, then take a smaller side path that looped back toward the trailhead. But somewhere along the way, I missed the turn. I didn't realize it at first. The forest all looked the same, endless trees, thick underbrush, the occasional clearing where sunlight filtered through the canopy. An hour passed, then another. The trail grew narrower, less defined. The footprints I had been following were gone. That's when I knew I wasn't on the right path anymore. I stopped to get my bearings, checked my map, pulled out my compass. The needle spun lazily, like it couldn't make up its mind. I tried my GPS, but there was no signal. Frustration gnawed at me. I wasn't lost. Not really. I just needed to backtrack, find where I had veered off, and a branch snapped behind me. I froze. The sound was close. Too close. I turned slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just the same endless forest. But something felt off. The woods were too quiet. No birds. No rustling leaves. No distant chatter of squirrels. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I swallowed hard and forced myself to keep moving. I walked for hours, trying to find my way back to the main trail. But the deeper I went, the worse it got. The trees felt closer, the undergrowth thicker, the air wrong, like the forest itself was watching me. Then through the trees I saw it. A cabin, old, weathered, half hidden beneath layers of moss and creeping vines. There was no reason for a cabin to be out here. No roads, no signs of human activity. But I was tired, my legs aching from miles of hiking. Maybe there was a map inside, maybe a radio, maybe help. I stepped closer. The door hung slightly open. I hesitated. Then, against every instinct screaming at me to turn back, I stepped inside. The air was stale, thick with the scent of rot and damp wood. Dust coated every surface. A small table, a single chair, a rusted stove in the corner. And on the floor, boot prints. Fresh. Someone had been here. Recently. My chest tightened. I turned to leave. Then I saw it. The journal. A small, leather-bound book, sitting open on the table. The handwriting was messy, frantic. I leaned in, my fingers trembling as I read. I don't know how long I've been out here. The trail is gone. The trees, they move when I'm not looking. I hear them whispering at night. If anyone finds this, do not follow the voices. A gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I grabbed the journal, shoved it into my pack, and bolted outside. I hiked fast. Too fast. My breath came in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away from that cabin. Then, as I stumbled through a tangle of roots, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees. Tall. Still. Watching me. I couldn't see a face. Just the outline of a person, barely visible through the shadows. I opened my mouth to call out. Maybe a hiker, maybe a park ranger. Then it moved. Not like a person. Not like anything I had ever seen. It shifted, almost gliding between the trees, its movements slow and deliberate. I ran. I don't know how long I ran. Minutes. Hours. The forest never changed. Every tree looked the same. Every shadow stretched impossibly long. My legs burned. My lungs screamed. And behind me, the whispers. Soft. Just at the edge of hearing. Not words. Not exactly. Just a sound. Like something trying to mimic human speech. I pressed forward, ignoring the ache in my body, the fear clawing at my chest. Then, a break in the trees. A road. My car. I stumbled forward, gasping, almost laughing in relief. I didn't even remember unlocking the door. Just throwing myself inside and locking it behind me. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. Headlights cut through the trees. And for just a second, I saw it standing at the edge of the forest. Watching. Still. Silent. Waiting. I never spoke about what happened. Not to my family. Not to my friends. I left the journal in a drawer, unread, untouched. But sometimes at night, I still hear it. A whisper. Soft. Indistinct. Just outside my window. Calling me back to the woods. And I'm terrified that one day, I might listen. I've always been a solo camper, and the woods are where I feel most at peace. There's something about being isolated from the noise of everyday life, surrounded only by trees and the hum of nature. I find clarity there. My favorite spot is a small clearing in the forests of Montana, miles from any trails or human activity. It's a place where I can set up camp, sit back, and forget the world. That particular weekend in late October, the weather had been crisp, the air sharp with the bite of fall, but it didn't deter me. I was used to the quiet of the deep woods. The silence of the trees had always comforted me in ways that no bustling city could. I arrived at my usual spot just before sunset. The trees were already casting long, slanting shadows across the forest floor. After gathering a pile of dry wood for the fire, I pitched my tent by a small stream that bubbled nearby. The stream had a calming effect, its sound mingling with the distant wind in the trees. I felt at home here. The first night passed uneventfully. I lit a fire, cooked a simple meal of beans and rice, and settled into my tent with a book. As darkness fell and the fire dwindled to glowing embers, I listened to the evening sounds, rustling leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the soft gurgle of the stream. There's nothing quite like the sound of nature at night. It's calming, soothing even. But as I lay there, tucked in my sleeping bag, something caught my attention. It was a zipper. A soft, quiet sound. I froze, holding my breath. For a moment, I thought it might be an animal, but then I heard it again, a second tent zipper. I hadn't seen any other campers when I arrived. In fact, I'd been sure I was alone in the area. The nearest trailhead was miles away, and there had been no vehicles parked nearby when I'd driven in. It couldn't have been another camper. But the sound was unmistakable. A tent zipper. My heart raced in my chest. I lay perfectly still, trying to listen more carefully, straining my ears for any further noise. The wind rustled the leaves outside, and the soft crackle of my dying fire seemed to fill the air, but nothing else. No footsteps. No rustling in the underbrush. Just the eerie silence of the woods at night. I waited, holding my breath. Seconds turned into minutes, and the zipper sound didn't repeat. Maybe I'd imagined it. The wind had been blowing through the trees earlier. Perhaps that had caused the noise. But I wasn't sure. I wasn't ready to chalk it up to the wind yet. I tried to force myself to relax, but that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. I knew something wasn't right. I hadn't heard the distinctive sound of a person walking toward the camp. No crunching of leaves, no snapping of twigs. Yet I could have sworn I heard the zipper of a tent. I told myself I was overthinking things, that the isolation was getting to me. The mind plays tricks when it's alone in the woods for too long, doesn't it? But then, just as I was about to drift off again, there it was. The zipper. This time, it was louder, more distinct. I shot up in my sleeping bag, eyes wide in the darkness. The sound had come from behind me, closer now. I could hear it as clearly as I had heard my own breathing. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. My mind raced. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? It was well past dark. The nearest trailhead was miles away. I hadn't seen a soul on my drive in. I carefully unzipped my own tent, just a crack, and peered out. The fire was still burning low, the glow casting long shadows across the clearing. But everything appeared normal. No one in sight. I scanned the area around me, but all I saw was the dark stretch of trees and underbrush, the night air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I closed the tent flap, pressing my back against the fabric as I tried to calm my breathing. I couldn't stop my mind from racing. Who could it have been? Was it a hiker who had gotten lost? A camper? No. If there had been someone else out there, I would have noticed their tracks when I arrived. No, this was something else. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and every little noise sent my pulse into overdrive. The rustling of leaves outside the tent sounded different now. It was like there was something, or someone out there, moving through the dark. The sound was subtle, barely audible, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on, shining it out through the mesh of the tent. The beam cut through the dark, bouncing off trees, but I saw nothing. Just shadows. I waited, listening for any more movement, but there was nothing. Was I losing it? Was I imagining all of this? I shook my head. I had to stay calm. I had to think logically. I decided I would pack up and leave. There was no way I was staying here alone, in the middle of the night, not knowing who or what was out there. I had camped in remote areas before, but this was different. My instincts were telling me something was off. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my gear and began to fold up my sleeping bag, trying to be as quiet as possible. But the sounds outside my tent were growing louder. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was out there, walking around my camp. I heard the crunch of footsteps in the dry leaves, moving slowly around the perimeter. The sound was coming from several directions, circling me, closing in. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. I looked out once more. The beam of my flashlight cut through the trees, but all I saw were shadows, movement that I couldn't quite make out. I began to feel suffocated by the darkness, the isolation, the overwhelming sense that something was just beyond the edge of my sight. The footsteps stopped. Complete silence. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to go. I had to leave this place before I became a target for whatever was out there. I threw the rest of my gear into my pack and zipped up my tent. The steps had stopped, but the eerie tension in the air remained. I had no idea who or what was out there, but it felt like I was being hunted. I unzipped the tent, poked my head out, and quickly surveyed the area. I could still hear the distant murmur of the stream, the occasional rustle of leaves in the trees, but nothing more. I could have sworn the footsteps were moving closer, as though someone was circling my camp, waiting for me to make a move. But there was nothing visible, no sign of human presence. I didn't waste any more time. I grabbed my pack, shoved the tent into the bag, and began to move toward my car. My heart hammered in my chest with every step. I kept my eyes on the shadows, every crack in the underbrush, expecting someone, or something, to jump out at me. The entire walk back to the car, I never once heard the zipping sound again. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. I felt the eyes on me. The presence lurking just outside the reach of the firelight, watching me, waiting. I made it to my car, shoved the gear in the trunk, and drove off, not daring to stop until I was well out of the forest. It's been years since that night, and I've never been back to that spot. I tell myself it was just a figment of my imagination, the product of isolation and a mind that had gone too long without sleep. But I'll never be certain. I still wonder, who was out there in the woods that night? What were they doing? And most chilling of all, what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did? I've spent most of my life in the woods. Grew up hunting with my dad and uncle, learned how to track animals, how to read the land, how to survive in the wilderness. I've always been comfortable out there, until the trip that changed everything. It was mid-November, the start of deer season in Montana, when I decided to head up to an area near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. It was about as remote as you could get without a guide. Thick pine forests, steep ridges, and miles of rough terrain that few people ever ventured into. It was my kind of place. I had a hunting partner for this trip, Ethan, an old friend from high school. We had been hunting together for years, but this time we had planned something more serious. We were going deep, way off the beaten path, where the big game roamed undisturbed. It was going to be a 4-day trip, and we packed accordingly: rifles, gear, plenty of food, and a satellite phone just in case. The first day went as planned. We set up camp in a clearing near a small creek, miles from any road or marked trail. The air was crisp, the scent of pine strong, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of crows. We scouted the area, found fresh tracks, and felt confident we'd bag a good buck before the trip was over. That night, we sat by the fire, talking about life, work, and the old days. Ethan had been having a rough year. His wife had left him, and he'd lost his job a few months back. This trip was supposed to clear his head, give him a break from everything. He seemed quiet, distracted, but I didn't press him. I figured the woods would do their work, give him some peace. The next morning, we split up. Ethan wanted to head up toward a ridge we had spotted the day before, while I planned to move toward a lower valley where I had seen deer tracks. We agreed to meet back at camp before dark. Ethan never came back. When the sun dipped below the trees and he still hadn't returned, I wasn't immediately worried. Maybe he had downed a deer and was dealing with the cleanup. Maybe he had lost track of time. It happens. I sat by the fire, waiting, the flames crackling in the cold night air. I cooked some beans and drank a little whiskey from my flask, keeping an eye on the dark forest beyond our campsite. By midnight, my gut started telling me something was wrong. Ethan was experienced. He wouldn't have just wandered off or ignored our agreement to return before dark. If he had shot something, he would have called on the satellite phone. But there had been no call. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and started hiking toward the ridge where he had gone that morning. The darkness felt heavier than usual, the kind that swallows sound. My boots crunched against the frozen ground, and every few steps, I stopped to listen. Nothing. No wind, no movement, just the distant rush of the creek. After about an hour of climbing, I reached the ridgeline. The moonlight cast long shadows through the trees, making everything look distorted and unnatural. I searched for any sign of Ethan, a spent cartridge, footprints, anything, but found nothing. That's when I saw it. A single spent rifle shell, lying in the dirt near a rock outcrop. No blood, no drag marks, just the shell. I picked it up, my mind racing. Had he taken a shot? If so, where was the deer? Where was he? I called his name, my voice cutting through the silence. No answer. I tried the satellite phone, but there was no response. The unease in my chest turned to something worse, something that made my skin crawl. I spent another hour searching before heading back to camp. Maybe he had found his way back while I was out looking. Maybe I was overreacting. But when I returned, the camp was just as I had left it, empty. At first light, I packed up some food and extra water, grabbed my rifle, and headed back up to the ridge. The morning air was sharp and cold, and my breath came out in thick clouds as I moved. I retraced my steps, searching the entire area where I had found the spent shell. This time, I looked closer. The dirt was disturbed in a way I hadn't noticed the night before, like someone had been pacing or moving in circles. There were boot prints, his I assumed, but they didn't lead anywhere. It was as if he had been standing in one spot, turning back and forth. Then nothing. No trail leading away. No sign of struggle. Just an abrupt end to his tracks. I spent the entire day searching. I moved in widening circles, calling his name, listening for any sound that might tell me where he had gone. I checked every possible path, every possible route he might have taken. Nothing. I tried the satellite phone again. Still no answer. That night, I built a larger fire than usual, the flames stretching high into the cold night air. I sat with my rifle across my lap, listening. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse jump. The forest felt different now. It felt wrong. By the third day, I knew I had to go for help. I had covered miles of terrain, searching every possible spot Ethan could have gone, and I was no closer to finding him. I had no choice but to hike back to my truck and drive to the nearest town. I packed up camp, but before leaving, I decided to take one last trip to the ridge. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I had missed something. Maybe I just couldn't leave without one final attempt. I climbed the ridge faster this time, moving with purpose. The sky was overcast, the forest darker than before. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees. I reached the spot where I had found the shell casing, and that's when I saw it. Ethan's backpack. It was sitting against a tree, half-zipped, as if he had left it there in a hurry. My stomach dropped. I rushed over, kneeling beside it, my hands shaking as I unzipped it fully. Inside were his supplies, his extra ammo, food, a half-empty water bottle. His knife was still in its sheath. His GPS was inside. His satellite phone was there too, the screen cracked. But no Ethan. It didn't make sense. He wouldn't have left without his gear. He wouldn't have gone anywhere without his satellite phone. And then I noticed something else. Just beyond the backpack, in the dirt, was a single boot print, not Ethan's. Someone else had been here. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone. Someone else had been in these woods. Someone who had been near Ethan's last known location. I grabbed his pack and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, my heart hammering in my chest. I drove straight to the nearest town, found the sheriff's office, and reported Ethan missing. Search teams scoured the area for weeks. Helicopters, dogs, dozens of people combing the forest. But there was no trace of Ethan. No body, no clothing, no blood. Just his backpack and that single boot print. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead. They said maybe he fell, maybe an animal got to him. But I don't believe that. I know someone else was out there. I know because I could feel it. I never went back. And I never will. I've spent most of my life in the woods. Grew up hunting, hiking, and fishing in the Appalachian backcountry, miles from civilization. Out there, you learn the land in ways most people never do. The way the wind moves through the trees, the sound of a creek bubbling even before you see it, the tracks left behind by animals that don't want to be found. But you also learn that some places aren't meant to be disturbed. It was late October when I took a solo trip deep into a part of the mountains I hadn't explored before. I had found an old map at a second-hand shop, one with handwritten notes scrawled in the margins. Hunting spots, water sources, and one phrase that caught my attention. Stay out of the hollow. It was written in shaky, almost frantic letters near a section of the forest that didn't even have trails marked. I thought about it for a while before shrugging it off. I wasn't the type to get scared over campfire stories. If anything, it made me more curious. I parked my truck on the edge of an old logging road and started my hike just after sunrise. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth strong from a recent rain. Leaves crunched under my boots as I made my way deeper into the forest, following a rough game trail. The first day was uneventful. I found a good clearing to set up camp, near a small stream. Made a fire, cooked some beans, and spent the evening watching the sky darken between the trees. But as I sat there, staring into the flames, something about the woods felt off. It was too quiet. No wind, no distant rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just silence. It was the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched. The next morning, I checked my map again. The hollow wasn't far. Just a few miles northeast, down into a valley. I started hiking early, moving carefully over the uneven ground. The deeper I went, the denser the trees became. The branches twisted together overhead, blocking out most of the morning sun. Then I started noticing the signs. The first was an old tree carving. Someone had hacked deep into the bark of a massive oak, carving two long vertical slashes with a single horizontal line crossing them, almost like tally marks. I frowned but kept going. Then I found the bones. A deer skull, picked clean, its antlers snapped. It wasn't uncommon to find remains in the woods, but something about this felt wrong. The way the bones were arranged in a perfect circle, the skull placed at the center, facing the direction I was heading. I hesitated, my grip tightening on my rifle. Maybe this was some old hunter's superstition. Maybe it was just coincidence. Or maybe I was heading exactly where I wasn't supposed to go. I should have turned back. By midday, I reached the hollow. It was a sunken stretch of land surrounded by steep ridges, thick with gnarled trees and tangled brush. The air felt colder here, heavier. Then I saw it. An old cabin, half-rotted and leaning to one side, barely visible through the trees. The wood was gray with age, the roof sagging, the door slightly ajar. I don't know what possessed me to get closer. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. But as I stepped onto the warped porch, the floorboards groaned beneath my weight. I pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay. Dust motes floated in the dim light streaming through a single cracked window. A table stood in the center of the room, cluttered with bones, small ones like birds or rabbits, arranged in spirals and lines. The walls were covered in marks. The same tally-like carvings I had seen on the tree, but here they covered every inch of wood. Some were deep, fresh. Others had faded with time. And then I saw the bed, or what was left of it. The mattress was gone, replaced with a tangle of fur and straw. Resting atop it was a pile of clothing. Torn flannel, muddy jeans, a single boot, all covered in dark stains. I felt my stomach turn. Something had lived here. Something that wasn't human. I turned to leave, but before I could step outside, something moved in the trees. A rustling, slow and deliberate. I froze. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the dim light filtering through the trees. But then it stepped forward. A man, if you could call it that. Gaunt, too tall, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His clothes were tattered, barely hanging onto his frame. His eyes were wrong, too deep, too dark, locked onto mine with an intensity that sent ice through my veins. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I slowly stepped back, gripping my rifle tight, but he didn't move. Then, as I reached the edge of the porch, his lips parted, and he smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, as if he had forgotten how. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes. I didn't stop to look back, didn't stop until I was halfway up the ridge. Then I heard it. Not footsteps, not breathing, laughter, low, rasping, just behind me. I didn't think. I raised my rifle, spinning around. But there was nothing there. The hollow was empty. The cabin stood silent. But the laughter was still there, slithering through the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck. I never reported what I found. What would I even say? That I saw a man who wasn't a man? That something watched me, followed me, laughed when it knew I was afraid? I tried to forget. But a few weeks later, I made the mistake of looking at the map again. And that's when I saw it. Near the words "Stay out of the hollow," there was something I hadn't noticed before. A name, scrawled in the same frantic handwriting as the warning. He smiles. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, hunting, hiking, camping alone. I know how to read a map, follow a compass, and judge how many miles I can cover before dark. That's why I still don't understand how I ended up on the wrong trail that day. It was late October, the kind of crisp autumn weather that makes the forest feel alive. The leaves were at their peak, glowing orange and red under the afternoon sun. I had planned a simple overnight trip, nothing too intense, just a loop through a remote section of national forest, then back to my truck in the morning. I had been on this trail before, years ago. It wasn't well marked, but I had a map, a GPS, and enough experience to feel confident. I started my hike around noon, moving at a steady pace, taking in the scenery. It felt good to be out there, away from everything. By late afternoon, I reached a fork in the trail. According to my map, the left path would take me toward a ridge where I planned to set up camp. The right path was an old logging road that eventually dead-ended. I barely glanced at the signs before turning left. But something was off. The trail felt different, narrower, more overgrown than I remembered. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe fewer people had hiked it this season. But as I walked, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The trees seemed wrong. I know that doesn't make sense, but it was the only way to describe it. The branches hung lower, tangled together in a way that blocked out more sunlight than they should. The air smelled damp, almost stale, like old leaves that had never fully dried. I checked my GPS. It showed I was still on the right path, but it felt like I was going deeper into the woods than I should have. Then I noticed the silence. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the distant chatter of squirrels. Just the sound of my own breathing and the crunch of my boots on the ground. I kept walking. I should have reached the ridge before sundown, but after another hour of hiking, I knew something was wrong. The trail had narrowed even more, barely a path at all. I hadn't seen a single sign of human activity, no footprints, no trail markers. But what really made me stop was what I saw ahead. A cabin. It was just sitting there, tucked into a small clearing off the trail, half hidden by trees. It wasn't on my map. I stepped closer, heart pounding. The place looked old, the wood dark with age, the windows dirty and cracked. The door was slightly ajar, swaying just a little in the evening breeze. I don't know why, but I felt like I was not supposed to be there. I turned back to the trail, planning to keep moving, but then I noticed something worse. There were no other trails. I spun in place, trying to make sense of it. I had been following a clear path just a minute ago, but now there was nothing. Just forest in every direction. That's when I heard it. A creak from inside the cabin, like someone shifting their weight on an old wooden floor. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my lungs were burning and my legs felt weak. I had no idea where I was. The sun had almost set, the shadows stretching long between the trees. I grabbed my GPS again, but now it wouldn't lock onto a signal. Just a blank screen, the little arrow frozen in place. I forced myself to take a slow breath. Panicking wouldn't help. I needed to find any sign of a trail. I walked for what felt like miles, scanning the ground for footprints, my footprints. But there was nothing. Then I saw the cabin again. Exactly the same as before. Same rotting wood. Same cracked windows. Same open door. I hadn't been walking in circles. I was sure of that. Yet somehow I was back. The light was almost gone now, the woods turning dark around me. I had two choices. Keep walking blindly through the forest or check the cabin for supplies, maybe a map, maybe a radio. I didn't want to go inside. But the thought of spending the night out here, lost and alone, was worse. I stepped onto the porch, wincing as the boards creaked under my weight. The open door loomed in front of me, the inside of the cabin too dark to see. I raised my flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of damp wood and decay pressing in around me. There was a small table, a chair, a fireplace filled with ashes that looked fresh. Someone had been here. Then I saw the bed, and the person sitting on it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a trick of the weak light. But then it moved, a slow, unnatural shift, like someone waking up after a long sleep. I couldn't breathe. The figure was too tall, its limbs too thin. Its face was turned away from me, just a dark shape against the wall. Then, in the silence, it stood up. I ran before I could see its face. I hit the porch at full speed, barely catching myself before I tumbled into the dirt. Behind me, I heard the sound of footsteps, slow but deliberate. I didn't look back. I just ran. The forest was completely dark now, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tore through the trees. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The footsteps followed, not running, just walking, as if whatever was behind me knew I couldn't escape. Then, just as I felt my strength failing, I saw something ahead, light. A flicker of orange through the trees. A campfire. I sprinted toward it, crashing into a clearing where 3 hikers sat around the flames, staring at me in shock. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath. Behind me, the woods were silent. Nothing followed. The hikers helped me back to the main trail, though I could barely explain what had happened. My map was useless, my GPS still frozen. But somehow, within 20 minutes of following them, we reached the road where my truck was parked. I never found that section of trail again. A week later, I went back with a friend, just to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. We followed the same path, took the same turns. But there was no fork in the trail. No cabin. No clearing. It was like that part of the forest had never existed. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, when I'm out in the woods alone, I swear I still hear those footsteps. I've been hunting since I was old enough to hold a rifle. My dad taught me everything: how to track, how to move quietly, how to respect the forest. I've spent more nights in the woods than I can count, but I've never been as afraid as I was that night. It was late November, deep into deer season. I was hunting alone in a stretch of national forest far from any towns or roads. I had planned for a 2-night trip, camping in a small clearing I had used before. The first day was uneventful. The air was cold, the trees bare. I tracked a few deer, but never got a clear shot. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to camp, built a fire, and settled in for the night. I should have gone home the next morning. The next day, I woke up early and headed deeper into the woods. The ground was frozen. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on dead leaves. After about 2 hours of walking, I came across a set of deer tracks. Large, fresh. They led into a thick part of the woods where the trees grew close together. I followed them, moving as quietly as I could. Then I saw it. A deer standing perfectly still in the trees, half hidden by branches. A buck, big and strong, at least 10 points on its antlers. But something was wrong. The deer wasn't moving. Not grazing, not flicking its ears, not even breathing. Just standing there. I raised my rifle, lining up the shot. But before I could pull the trigger, the deer's head snapped toward me. Not turned. Snapped. The movement was too fast, too unnatural. The deer's eyes locked onto mine, dark and empty. Then it bolted. But it didn't run like a deer. It moved in long, jerky strides, arms swinging at its sides. Its body lurched forward, more like a man than an animal, crashing through the trees with impossible speed. I just stood there, my rifle shaking in my hands. That wasn't a deer. I should have left right then, but I told myself I was seeing things. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the cold was getting to me. I kept hunting, but the woods were wrong now. There were no birds, no rustling in the brush. Even the wind had stopped. Just silence pressing in from all sides. I tracked for another hour before giving up. I wasn't thinking about hunting anymore. I just wanted to get back to camp before dark. But the woods had changed. The trees looked different, taller, closer together. The path I had taken was gone. I checked my GPS. The screen flickered, then died. That's when I heard it. A voice. Not words, just a low, garbled sound, like someone trying to speak through a mouth full of water. It came from behind me. I turned, heart pounding. And there it was. It stood about 30 yards away, just inside the trees. At first glance, it looked like a deer. Tall, thin, covered in patchy brown fur. But the longer I stared, the less sense it made. Its legs were too long, its body too narrow. Its front limbs, not legs, arms, hung at its sides, fingers twitching. And its face. It was almost a deer's face, but stretched, distorted. The eyes were too large, too dark, set deep into a human-like skull. The jaw hung open slightly, and as I watched, it twitched, like it was struggling to move its own mouth. It took a step toward me. I raised my rifle, aiming at its chest. My hands were shaking. The thing cocked its head, studying me. Then, in that same wet, choking voice, it said, "Help me." I fired. The shot echoed through the trees, but the thing didn't flinch, didn't bleed, didn't move. Then slowly it smiled. I ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just ran. Branches tore at my jacket, roots snagged my boots, but I didn't stop. Behind me, I could hear something moving. Not running, just walking. But every time I slowed, the sound was closer. I don't know how long I ran before I saw the light through the trees. My campfire. I crashed into the clearing, lungs burning, heart pounding. I grabbed my pack, my keys, anything I could carry, and bolted toward my truck. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was watching. I drove all night, hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, miles from the forest. I barely slept for a week. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing, that face, those two dark eyes, that horrible, twisted smile. I never went back to that forest. But sometimes on cold November nights, when the woods are quiet and the wind stops blowing, I swear I can still hear it. That garbled, wet voice, whispering from the trees, "Help me." There's something about being alone in the woods that makes you feel like you're being watched. Even when you know you're miles from the nearest person, When the trees close in around you and the wind stops, that feeling creeps in. I was never the kind to get spooked easily. I grew up hiking, camping, and hunting. I knew how to handle myself in the wild. But some things don't care how much experience you have. Some things just watch. It started when I took a solo camping trip into a remote section of national forest. I'd been planning it for months, a weekend of quiet, deep in the wilderness, away from people, noise, and the stress of everyday life. I parked my truck at the trailhead, hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, and set off. The first few hours were peaceful. The crisp autumn air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the only sounds were the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves and the occasional rustling of squirrels darting through the underbrush. I hiked deeper than I had planned, enjoying the solitude. When the sun dipped lower in the sky, I found a clearing near a small creek and set up camp. That was the first time I noticed something off. As I gathered firewood, I felt it. That creeping unease, like someone was watching me. I stopped, turning in a slow circle. The trees stood silent, motionless. No movement, no sound. Just an emptiness that felt wrong. Shaking it off, I built a fire and cooked dinner. The crackling flames eased my nerves, and by the time darkness settled over the forest, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. But then I saw it, high up in the trees. A shape, too dark, too still, perched in the upper branches of an old oak about 50 yards from my camp. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the firelight, a thick shadow cast by the flames. But when I shifted my head, the shadow didn't move. It stayed there, watching. I tried to ignore it. Maybe it was a broken limb, a thick tangle of vines. Anything other than what my gut was telling me. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. But sleep didn't come. The woods were too quiet. Not just nighttime in the forest quiet. Dead quiet. No wind. No crickets. No rustling leaves. Just the heavy stillness of something waiting. Then, in the distance, I heard the sound of something moving through the trees. Not through the brush, through the trees. High up, branches creaked under its weight, leaves rustled, but there were no footsteps on the ground. I held my breath, gripping my knife, listening as whatever it was moved closer. Then it stopped, right above my tent. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The only sound was the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, a soft tapping on my tent's roof. Light, slow, deliberate, like fingertips brushing against the fabric. I swallowed hard, my fingers tightening around the handle of my knife. I wanted to tear out of that tent, run for my life. But where? My truck was miles away, and I didn't even know what I was running from. The tapping stopped. Silence. Then, the zipper of my tent moved. Just an inch. Then another. Something was outside. Something knew I was in there. I acted on instinct. I lunged forward, shoving the knife into the fabric, tearing a hole through the side of the tent. I burst out, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other, whipping around. Nothing. Just my campfire, smoldering in the pit. My pack where I left it. The trees standing tall and silent. Then I looked up. The shadow was still there. Perched in the lowest branches now, just 10 feet off the ground. And for the first time, I could see its shape. It was humanoid, but wrong. Too long. Too thin. Its arms and legs stretched in unnatural proportions, fingers like claws gripping the bark. Its face, if it had one, was hidden in darkness. But I knew it was looking at me. I ran. I didn't pack up. Didn't think. I just ran. Branches whipped my face, roots tried to trip me, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, until I heard the trees above me shaking. It was following me, moving from branch to branch, silent except for the occasional creak of wood under its weight. I ran harder, lungs burning, legs aching. I tripped, fell, scrambled back up. My flashlight flew from my grip, landing somewhere in the darkness. I didn't stop for it. The trail blurred ahead, and then a break in the trees. I burst into the open, nearly collapsing onto the dirt road where my truck was parked. I fumbled for my keys, throwing myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. For a split second, I dared to look back. There, at the edge of the trees, it stood. Not in the branches anymore. On the ground. Tall. Motionless. Watching. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. My tires spun in the dirt, and I sped away, gravel flying behind me. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I never went back to that part of the forest. Never told anyone the full story. But sometimes late at night, when the wind is still and the trees stand silent, I remember that shadow in the tree, and I wonder if it's still waiting. The forest swallowed me whole the moment I stepped off the main trail. I had been hiking alone since dawn, planning to follow a narrow, unmarked game trail through a stretch of deep woods that few people ever set foot in. The kind of place where maps don't help, where GPS signals vanish, and where the only sounds are the ones you make, and the ones you don't recognize. I had done my research beforehand. The area was dense, remote, and overgrown, but I liked that. I had experience with solo hikes, and I trusted my ability to navigate, even when the path was rough. I carried a compass, a topographic map, extra water, food, a knife, and a headlamp in case I was out longer than expected. The plan was simple: follow the game trail, explore for a few hours, and circle back before dusk. I thought I knew what I was doing. The first few miles were uneventful. The trail was faint but manageable, a narrow strip of packed dirt winding through a sea of towering pines. The undergrowth was thick in some areas, but I pushed through, stepping over fallen logs and ducking beneath low-hanging branches. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. At first, I welcomed the stillness. No distant hum of traffic, no other hikers chattering. Just the sounds of nature, my boots crunching leaves, the occasional rustling of unseen animals. But as the hours passed, I realized something unsettling. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, the whisper of wind through the trees, had faded. It wasn't just quiet. It was dead silent. No wind, no movement, no life. Just me. The first real sign that something was wrong came when I checked my compass. The needle spun erratically, twitching back and forth like it couldn't decide which way was north. I tapped it, shook it, held it still. It kept spinning. I told myself it was just a fluke, a malfunction. Maybe the minerals in the soil were interfering with it. But deep down, I felt the first creeping tendrils of unease. I decided to turn back. That's when I realized I wasn't sure which way was back. The trees all looked the same. Tall, dark, dense. The game trail I had been following had gradually disappeared without me noticing, dissolving into the undergrowth like it had never existed. I stopped walking and forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. I pulled out my map, trying to orient myself based on the terrain. Nothing looked familiar. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, scanning the forest floor for any sign of my original path, footprints, broken branches, anything. But the more I searched, the more everything blurred together into a never-ending maze of trees. Panic started pressing against the edges of my mind. I knew better than to let it take over. I needed to move in a straight line, find higher ground, get my bearings. I picked a direction and walked. For what felt like hours, I pushed forward, hoping I would stumble across something familiar. But the deeper I went, the more I felt like I was walking in circles. The same fallen logs, the same clusters of ferns, the same twisted, gnarled tree that looked eerily like a bent human figure. At some point, I stopped to drink some water, my hands shaking as I unscrewed the bottle. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh. A single pair of boot prints, slightly larger than mine, pressed into the damp earth. They weren't old, either. Edges still sharp, not yet softened by time or weather. Someone else was out here. I should have felt relieved. But instead, my stomach twisted into knots. The footprints didn't follow a trail. They wove in and out of the trees in an erratic pattern, like whoever made them had been wandering aimlessly or circling. A cold weight settled in my chest. I crouched down, examining them closer. The prints were deep. Whoever left them was heavy or carrying something. And the worst part, there was no sign of them leading away. Just arriving. Stopping. Like someone had stood in that exact spot. Watching. I stood up slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. But I wasn't alone. I kept moving. Faster now. More desperate. The sun was sinking, and I had no shelter, no idea which way to go. Every step felt like a gamble. Was I getting closer to safety, or deeper into something I didn't want to understand? By the time the last light faded, I had no choice but to stop. I found a large tree with a thick, exposed root system and wedged myself between them, my back against the trunk. It wasn't much, but it felt safer than being completely exposed. I didn't build a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. The night was suffocatingly dark. And then at some point I heard it. A single, deliberate footstep. Close. Then another. The sound of someone moving slowly through the brush. Not an animal. Too heavy. Too steady. I held my breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I stayed awake all night, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. At first light, I forced myself to move. My body was stiff, exhausted, but I couldn't afford to rest. I needed to get out. That's when I saw them. New footprints. Closer than before. Leading directly to the tree where I had slept. I felt sick. Someone had been standing over me in the dark. Watching. Exceptoriginal. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the undergrowth, tearing through thorn-covered branches, lungs burning. Hours passed. Maybe more. The forest never seemed to end. But then, a sound. Distant. Faint. Water. A stream. I followed it. My legs were weak, my vision blurred, but I followed it. And then civilization. A dirt road. A parked truck. A fisherman casting his line into the stream. I stumbled toward him, half delirious, barely able to speak. I never told him what happened. Never told anyone. But I never went back into those woods again. Because some places aren't meant to be found. And some people don't want to be found. There are places in the woods where the darkness doesn't just settle, it swallows. Places where no matter how much moonlight touches the trees, the shadows seem thicker, heavier. I never used to think much about it. I'd camped alone plenty of times, and the night had always been just that, the night. Dark, quiet, familiar. But this night was different. I was camping near a river, a small one, barely deep enough to reach my knees, its surface broken only by the occasional rock jutting out like the spine of some buried thing. The woods around me were dense, thick with towering trees that blocked out most of the sky, but I wasn't too deep in. I could still find my way out in the morning. I had spent most of the evening sitting by my tent, watching the fire burn low, listening to the sounds of the forest. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen animals moving through the underbrush. I should have felt at ease. This was routine. I had done this a dozen times before. But something felt off. I didn't know what it was at first. Just a feeling. A weight in my chest that made me glance over my shoulder more often than usual. The fire flickered, its glow stretching into the trees, but the darkness beyond felt deeper than it should have. Almost as if it was pressing in, waiting for the flames to die. I didn't like it, so I decided to take a walk. It wasn't something I normally did after dark, but I told myself I just needed to clear my head. Maybe stretch my legs, get away from the fire's glow for a bit. I grabbed my flashlight and followed a narrow dirt path that ran alongside the river. The ground was uneven, the roots twisting underfoot, but I walked carefully, keeping the water to my right. The river moved slow, smooth, reflecting the trees like a perfect mirror. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and moss. Then the light changed. Or rather, it disappeared. 1 second, the trees around me were bathed in the weak glow of my flashlight. The next, I was surrounded by complete, suffocating blackness. My chest tightened. I stopped walking, gripping the flashlight tighter, and clicked it off, then on again. The beam flickered to life, illuminating nothing but the path ahead. But something was wrong. A moment before, I could have sworn I had seen light. Not my own, not the flashlight, but something else. A faint, silvery glow coming from the trees. I had seen it. I was sure of it. And now it was gone. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The feeling in my chest tightened. I turned slowly, trying to find the source of the light I had seen. Nothing. Only darkness. The trees were just outlines against the night sky, towering and unmoving. The fire from my camp was nowhere in sight. I looked down at the river. And there, in the water, I saw myself. My reflection was clear, clearer than it had any right to be. The water was still, too still, the surface undisturbed despite the gentle flow of the current. It was like looking into a sheet of black glass. I stared at my own face, my own eyes staring back. But something about it made my stomach twist. It wasn't wrong exactly. It was me. But it wasn't right either. The longer I looked, the worse it felt. The eyes in the reflection were mine, but they seemed too empty. My face was expressionless, hollow. The dark circles under my eyes looked deeper, my skin paler. Like something had drained all the life from me. It wasn't the kind of fear that comes from seeing something supernatural. No ghosts, no creatures lurking in the shadows. It was worse. It was real. I saw myself, and I didn't like what I saw. The water was showing me something I didn't want to admit. I had been feeling it for a long time, that creeping dissatisfaction, that quiet hopelessness I never talked about. I had never been happy. Not really. I had spent so much time trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself I was fine, that things were normal, that this was just how life was. But the reflection didn't lie. I saw myself as I truly was. Not the person I wanted to be. Not the person I pretended to be. Just me. And I hated it. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My own face stared back, empty and lost, and for the first time, I knew I might never be able to change. That was the real fear. Not the darkness, not the woods, but the realization that no matter what I did, no matter how much I tried, I would always be the same. I tore my gaze away from the water and forced myself to move. I walked fast, my breaths uneven, my pulse hammering. The path felt longer than before, stretching endlessly through the darkness. The silence pressed in around me, heavier than before, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. When I reached my camp, I didn't stop moving. I threw my things into my pack, zipped the tent closed without care, and left. I didn't look back. I didn't camp alone again after that. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I was afraid of what I might see. I've spent a lot of time alone in the wilderness, about hunting, hiking, exploring, just being out where no one else is. It's where I feel the most free, but also where I've had some of the worst scares of my life. The kind that stay with you, that make you hesitate before heading out again, no matter how much you love it. Some of them I can explain, some I can't, and some I'd rather forget. But they all happened, and they all remind me how quickly things can go wrong when you're alone, miles from anyone who could help. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes. Neither does the deep forest, the mountains, or the rivers. And neither do people, when you run into the wrong ones. I was in a slot canyon when the rain started. I had checked the forecast before heading out, like I always did. No real chance of rain, just a slight possibility of some clouds in the afternoon. I was deep in a narrow stretch of canyon, smooth walls rising on either side, just wide enough for me to stretch my arms out and touch both at the same time. There was only one way forward and one way back. That's the way it is in slot canyons. You don't have a lot of choices if something goes wrong. I wasn't thinking about rain when I first heard it. A dull, distant roar, like wind rushing through a tight space. But the air was still. Then I felt a drop on my arm. Looked up. The sky was a narrow strip above me, gray and shifting. A few more drops hit my face. I knew what was coming before I even turned back. The thing about flash floods is, they don't start where you are. They start miles away, in places you can't see, where the rain is already pouring down, filling up dry creek beds that turn into rivers in minutes. That water has nowhere to go but downhill, into canyons like the one I was standing in. I ran. The walls were too smooth, too high to climb. The floor was just wet sand, no rocks to scramble up. I pushed as fast as I could, lungs burning, trying to reach a wider part of the canyon where maybe, I could get up somewhere high. The sound grew louder, like a jet engine. Then I saw it. A wall of water, thick with mud, rolling toward me like something alive. It wasn't high, maybe 2 or 3 feet, but that was enough. It would knock me down, drag me under, pin me against the canyon walls. I had seconds. I jumped. There was a small ledge to my left, barely a foot wide. I grabbed at it, digging my fingers into a crack, kicking my feet against the wall to push myself up. My muscles screamed. I pulled, knowing if I slipped, that was it. My foot found a hold. My other hand gripped a tiny knob of rock. Then the water hit. The force of it slammed into my legs, almost tearing me away from the wall. My boots slipped, but my arms held. The water surged past, cold and fast, carrying sticks, sand, anything loose. It filled the canyon floor in seconds. I stayed up there, heart pounding, legs shaking, until the flood slowed to a thick, churning river. I was soaked in sweat, breathing so hard I felt dizzy. It was a long time before I climbed down. The canyon was unrecognizable. The floor had changed, reshaped in minutes by the force of the flood. If I had been just a little slower, I would have been part of it. It was just before dawn when I saw him. I was out bow hunting, alone, deep in the woods. The world was still dark, the kind of quiet that only exists before the sun rises. I was moving slow, trying not to make noise, trying to keep the wind in my favor. Then I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps. Human. I turned, gripping my bow. At first, I thought it was another hunter. But then I saw how he was walking, stumbling, unsteady. The way he was swinging his arms, like he was trying to keep his balance. I could smell him before he got close. Alcohol, sweat, something else. Then he saw me. He stopped, swayed on his feet. I stood still, not moving, waiting to see what he'd do. He muttered something I couldn't hear, then suddenly lunged forward. I backed up fast. He came after me, reaching out. I didn't know if he wanted my gear, if he was just out of his mind, or if he meant to hurt me. I pulled an arrow from my quiver, held it in my hand like a dagger, ready to stab if he got too close. Then he stopped, just stood there, swaying. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. And then, just like that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I waited until the sun was fully up before I moved again. I should have known something was wrong the second I smelled it. I was pushing through a thick patch of thorn bushes, working my way toward a ridge, when the scent hit me. Chemical. Sharp. Wrong. Then I saw it. A makeshift camp, half hidden in the brush. A tarp strung between trees. Burned out cans. Plastic jugs. The kind of trash that doesn't belong in the woods. I froze. There was no sign of anyone, but that didn't mean they weren't there. People who cook meth in the middle of nowhere aren't the kind you want to surprise. They don't call the cops. They don't ask questions. They just deal with problems their own way. I backed up slow, every step careful. A twig snapped under my boot. Silence. Then movement. From inside the camp. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was a mile away. It was late afternoon when I saw them. Big, rangy farm dogs. A whole pack of them. They spotted me at the same time I spotted them. And they came straight for me. I ran for the nearest rock outcrop, scrambling up, pulling myself onto a wide, flat boulder. The dogs circled below, barking, growling, snapping at the air. I had my bow, but my arrows weren't meant for this. Most were blunts, for small game. Not much good against a pack of dogs. I sat still. Waited. The dogs didn't leave. Minutes passed. Half an hour. An hour. They paced, watched. Then, without warning, they turned and walked away, one by one, vanishing into the desert. I climbed down slow, watching the shadows. Then I hiked out, never looking back. I still go into the wilderness, but I know now how fast things can go wrong. The flood taught me that nature doesn't care about your plans. The drunk man taught me that people can be just as dangerous as anything else out there. The meth lab showed me that evil doesn't just exist in cities. And the dogs, they reminded me that sometimes you just get lucky. I don't take luck for granted anymore. I never wanted this place back. When I sold it, I thought I was finally free. Free from the nightmares, free from the sick feeling in my gut, free from whatever it was that lurked in the corners of the house, watching. I thought I had escaped, but the property had a way of pulling people in, and in my case, it yanked me back with both hands. When the new owners lost everything, their license, their sanity, their control over themselves, I was forced to take it back. They had done things in that house. Dark things. The damage was more than just broken windows and trashed walls. They had brought something out of the house, something that had been waiting, something that had been buried for too long. I had seen too much already. I had been living with the fear, pushing it down, forcing myself to pretend that the footsteps, the voices, the unnatural cold spots were all in my head. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore. Her. I don't know what she was. I don't even want to think about it now. But I saw her more than once. The first time was the worst. It happened on a night like any other. I was exhausted, my body aching, my mind stretched thin from the stress of trying to keep everything together. The 3 elderly residents I cared for were already asleep, their doors closed, their rooms quiet. I had been drifting in and out of an uneasy sleep when I had a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I was floating, not in the way dreams usually feel. This was different. I could feel the cold air pressing against my skin. I could feel my hair moving slightly, like there was a draft in the room. And then I saw him. Al. He was one of the residents, a quiet man in his late 70s. He slept on his back, his arms folded across his chest in a way that reminded me too much of a corpse. I saw him clearly, but it wasn't through my own eyes. I was hovering above him, looking down, moving closer, feeling something inside me curl with hunger, with some awful, crawling sensation that didn't belong to me. And then Al's eyes opened. He didn't move. He just stared up, stared straight into me. into whatever I was in that moment. I woke up gasping. The room was cold, my skin covered in goosebumps. For a few seconds, I sat there, breathing hard, trying to shake off the dream. Then I heard it. A voice. A woman's voice, hoarse and broken, singing. "Ring around the rosy." It was coming from the baby monitor. I froze. My whole body locked up. I knew that voice didn't belong to anyone in the house. I was alone, apart from the 3 sleeping residents. The voice kept singing, dragging out the words, stretching them into something slow and wrong. My hands were shaking as I climbed out of bed. I didn't want to go to AL's room. I didn't want to see if he was lying the same way I had seen in my dream. But I had to. I stepped into the hallway, my breath fogging in front of me. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. The closer I got to his room, the worse it got. I turned the corner, and there he was, lying on his back, arms folded over his chest, just like in my dream. I felt my stomach drop. The voice was still singing. I ran back to my room, yanking the baby monitor from the wall. The cord snapped. I ripped the batteries out, throwing them to the floor. The voice didn't stop. It kept singing. I pulled the blankets over my head and sat there, too afraid to move. I don't remember falling asleep. I only remember the cold and the feeling that something was standing right outside my door waiting. After that night, things got worse. The house felt different, like something had been stirred up, like something had finally woken up. Doors slammed on their own. The temperature would drop suddenly, no matter how high I turned up the heat. I'd hear scratching in the walls, in the floors, even though there were no rats, no mice, nothing that could make that kind of sound. Then there were the dreams. Always the same. Floating, looking through her eyes. Watching. Waiting. The worst part was that I never saw her fully. Just glimpses. A shape in the corner of my eye, a reflection in the window when no one was there. But I felt her. She was always there. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that stress and lack of sleep were making me see things. But I knew better. The house was rotting from the inside out. I could feel it in my body, in my mind. Even my health was failing. Doctors ran tests, found nothing. I was exhausted all the time. My skin was pale, my hands weak. Something was draining me. And then the death started. First, it was Al. I found him one morning, lying exactly as I had seen him in my dream. Cold. Still. Gone. Then the others. One by one. Even my partner. He lasted a few more months before he was gone too. I was the only one left. And the house wasn't finished with me. I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was the debt. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was something worse. I knew I needed to leave. I knew I had to get out. But I didn't. I started avoiding certain rooms. Certain corners of the house where I could feel her waiting. Some nights, I'd wake up to the sound of breathing. Right next to my bed. I stopped looking in mirrors. I didn't want to see what was standing behind me. I was wasting away. No one could explain it. And I didn't want to try anymore. The house had taken everything from me. I put the property up for sale again. I just needed one buyer. One person desperate enough to take it. And then I'd be free. The day I signed the final paperwork, I didn't feel relief. I felt nothing. I packed what little I had left and drove away without looking back. But sometimes even now I hear it. A voice, soft, broken, whispering just at the edge of my hearing. Ring around the rosy. And I know the house is still waiting. For someone else. For the next person who won't believe. Not until it's too late. I've always loved the wilderness. There's something about being completely cut off from civilization, surrounded only by trees, mountains, and the vast silence of nature. I've gone on countless backpacking trips, sometimes alone, sometimes with a friend. This time, I wasn't alone. My friend Mark and I had planned a 5-day trek deep into Washington State's backcountry. We had done our research, mapped out a good route, and packed light but efficiently. The area we chose wasn't on any major hiking trails. It was remote, untouched, perfect for escaping the noise of everyday life. We were experienced enough to handle rough terrain and unpredictable weather. What we weren't prepared for was the feeling of being watched. We started early in the morning, parking the car at a small pull-off on a dirt road that looked rarely used. From there, we hiked in, following an old logging road for the first few miles before veering off onto an unmarked game trail. It was rough, overgrown in places, but manageable. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The birds, the wind through the trees, even the occasional scurry of a squirrel. Everything felt muted. "Man, it's almost too quiet," Mark said after a few hours. I nodded, feeling it too. There was an eerie stillness in the air, like the woods were holding their breath. But I pushed the thought away. We were deep in the forest, far from any human activity. It made sense for things to be quiet. We reached a small clearing by late afternoon and decided to make camp. A narrow stream ran nearby, perfect for filtering water. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. The air was cool, the fire crackled, and for a while, everything felt normal. The next day, we packed up and hiked deeper into the forest. Our plan was to find a good spot near a larger river, about 10 miles in. The terrain got steeper, and the trees grew denser. The feeling of stillness hadn't left. If anything, it had gotten stronger. We found a decent clearing by late afternoon and set up camp again. As the sun dipped behind the trees, we sat by the fire, eating our meals and talking about life. Then, just as I was about to say something, I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, barely there, like someone speaking just out of earshot. I stopped mid-sentence and looked at Mark. He was staring into the trees, his expression unreadable. "You heard that?" I asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah." We both turned our flashlights toward the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows and the occasional flicker of light against the trunks. "Must be the wind," Mark said, but his voice didn't sound convinced. I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. Wind doesn't form words. We tried to shake it off, but the night felt different now. Heavier. When we finally went to our tents, I lay awake for hours listening. I didn't hear anything else, but the silence itself felt wrong. The next morning, we debated whether to move further in or stay put for another night. We decided to stay. It was a good campsite, close to water, and we were both probably just imagining things. By late afternoon, the air had changed. The stillness had deepened, and it felt like the forest was pressing in on us. I tried to ignore it, focusing on collecting firewood while Mark filtered water at the stream. Then, as I was arranging the logs by the fire pit, I heard it again. A whisper. But this time it was closer. It was the same hushed murmuring from the night before, low, unintelligible, like someone speaking just below the edge of comprehension. My body tensed. I turned, scanning the trees, but nothing moved. "Mark," I called out. "Yeah." His voice came from the stream, a good 30 feet away. I swallowed. "You hear that?" Silence. Then, after a moment, "Yeah." It wasn't just one whisper this time. It was several, overlapping, surrounding us. They weren't loud, but they were there. We stood back to back, flashlights sweeping the trees. Nothing. The whispering stopped. The forest held its breath again. We didn't talk much that night. We just sat by the fire, listening. The whispering didn't come back, at least not while we were awake. By morning, we were exhausted. Neither of us had slept much. Something about this place was wrong, and we both knew it. We agreed to pack up and start heading back. There was no reason to stay. The hike out was slow. The feeling of being watched never left. Every so often, we'd hear movement, branches shifting, leaves crunching, but whenever we stopped to look, nothing was there. Then, as we neared the area where we had camped the first night, the whispering returned. It was daylight, but it didn't matter. It was there, following us, just beyond our sight. A constant, steady murmur. We picked up the pace. Neither of us spoke. We just moved. Fast. When we finally reached the old logging road, the whispering stopped. Just stopped. The air felt normal again. The forest no longer pressed in on us. The silence was just silence. We didn't stop walking until we reached the car. As we loaded our gear, Mark finally spoke. "We're never coming back here." I nodded. Agreed. We never told anyone else about what happened. It didn't feel like something people would understand. But we knew one thing for sure. Something was in those woods with us. And it was watching. I was 16 when my family decided to rent a remote cabin for a long weekend. My dad had found it through some obscure listing, lured in by its cheap price and promise of absolute seclusion. He had always preferred quiet, isolated places over tourist-heavy spots, and this cabin, nestled deep in the woods of Pennsylvania, seemed perfect. It was about a 4-hour drive from our home. The first half of the journey was spent on highways, but as we got closer, the roads became narrower and rougher. The last stretch was a winding dirt road, cutting through dense forest. Trees towered on either side, their branches stretching overhead, blocking most of the sunlight. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow through the trees. The cabin itself was small and old, built from dark, weathered wood. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. There was no phone service, no Wi-Fi, just us, the trees, and whatever lived among them. As soon as we got out of the car, I felt the silence. Not just quiet, but an eerie stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves. Just the occasional creak of the trees shifting in the wind. My parents didn't seem to notice. My dad unlocked the door, while my mom carried in our bags. I stood outside for a moment, scanning the tree line. Something about this place unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living room with an old couch and a wood-burning stove, a tiny kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a bathroom. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood. My room was at the far end of the cabin, with a single bed and a small window that overlooked the forest. As night fell, we settled in. My dad started a fire in the stove, and my mom cooked a simple dinner. We ate by candlelight since the cabin's electricity was weak, and the single overhead bulb barely lit the room. The quiet outside felt heavier after dark, pressing against the walls of the cabin. That first night passed without incident, though I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing outside my window, just beyond the trees, watching. The second night was when it happened. It was around 2 a.m. when I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. The cabin was silent, the only sound my parents' soft breathing from their room down the hall. Then I noticed a faint glow outside my window. I sat up, heart pounding. It wasn't bright, just a weak, flickering light moving through the trees. My first thought was that it was my dad. Maybe he had gone outside for some reason. But as I watched, the light wove between the trees, dipping and rising, disappearing and reappearing. A fire. Someone was carrying a fire through the woods. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and crept to the window. Pressing my face against the glass, I strained to see. The light was further away now, deeper in the forest. It moved unnaturally, too smooth, too fluid. Then it stopped. For several long seconds, nothing moved. The light hovered, barely visible between the trunks. I held my breath, waiting. Then something stepped into view. A shadowy figure, just beyond the reach of the glow. It was tall, its outline barely distinguishable against the dark trees. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood there, watching the cabin. A sharp chill ran down my spine. I wanted to wake my parents, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, locked in place by a feeling I couldn't explain. Fear, yes, but something else too. Something deeper. Then, slowly, the figure stepped back into the trees. The light faded, and then it was gone. I stayed at the window for what felt like forever, heart hammering. I kept expecting the light to return, for the figure to step back into view. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin, listening to the silence outside until sleep finally claimed me. The next morning, I told my dad what I had seen. He frowned, but didn't seem too concerned. Probably just a hunter, he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. A hunter? At 2 a.m, carrying a fire. He shrugged. Some people go night hunting. Maybe they were just passing through. I knew he was just trying to reassure me, but something in his voice sounded forced, like he didn't fully believe his own words. After breakfast, I decided to check outside. My parents were busy tidying up the cabin, so I stepped out alone. The morning air was cool, the forest still eerily quiet. I walked toward the tree line, to the spot where I had seen the light. The ground was damp from the night's dew, the leaves dark and heavy. At first, I saw nothing unusual, but then I noticed something in the dirt. Footprints. They were large, human-shaped, and led from the trees toward the cabin. The steps were deep, as if the person had been walking slowly, deliberately. And then they stopped. The last footprint was just a few feet from the cabin wall, directly beneath my bedroom window. My stomach clenched. Whoever had been in the woods last night hadn't just been passing through. They had come all the way to the cabin. They had stood outside my window, watching. I swallowed hard and turned back to the cabin. I didn't tell my parents about the footprints. I didn't want them to brush it off again. But from that moment on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. That evening, I refused to go to bed right away. I stayed in the living room with my parents, pretending to read a book while my dad stoked the fire. Every few minutes, I glanced at the window, waiting for the light to return. Midnight passed. Then 1 a.m. Just as I was beginning to think maybe it wouldn't happen again, I saw it. The same flickering glow, moving through the trees. My breath caught in my throat. My hands clenched around the book. Then it stopped. And this time it was closer. I didn't move. I barely breathed. The figure emerged again, stepping into the faint glow of the fire. But this time I could see more. A man, tall, thin, wearing what looked like an old, tattered coat. His face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking. He was facing the cabin, facing me. Then, slowly, he lifted something in his hand. A lantern. He held it up slightly, as if presenting it. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows across his figure. Then he turned, and without a sound, he walked back into the woods. I sat frozen for what felt like hours. My parents had fallen asleep, unaware. I wanted to wake them, to tell them what I had seen, but some instinct told me not to. Instead, I sat by the fire, wide-eyed, waiting for dawn. The next morning, I convinced my parents to leave early. I didn't tell them the full truth, just that I was feeling uneasy, that I wasn't enjoying the trip. My dad seemed hesitant, but my mom agreed. By noon, we were packed and on the road. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. The cabin stood silent in the clearing, the forest dense and unmoving behind it. And just beyond the trees, barely visible through the branches, I saw a faint flicker of light. The camp was massive. It stretched for what felt like miles, clusters of wooden bunkhouses scattered between thick patches of trees, open fields, a barnyard, even a pool. It had been built for summer campers, but since it was only May, my synagogue was using it for a weekend event. 3 nights of outdoor activities, prayers, bonding, standard stuff. By the last night, everyone was exhausted. The days had been packed with group hikes, team-building exercises, and campfire dinners. By the time the sun set, most people were already winding down for the night, getting ready to enjoy the last sleep before we packed up in the morning. But there was still one final event for the seniors. A midnight hangout in the library, something special just for the 12th graders. I wanted to go. It was the last real night, and I didn't want to miss out. The problem was, I wasn't staying in the senior bunks. My cousin was a year younger than me, and we had chosen to bunk together, which meant I was on the far side of the camp. And by the time I found out about the hangout, most people were already half asleep. No one was going to walk with me. I almost stayed in bed, almost decided it wasn't worth it. But people kept telling me how fun it was going to be. The last big gathering before we all went home. I didn't want to be the one who missed out, the one who had to hear about it secondhand. So I told myself it wasn't a big deal. Just a short walk across the camp. Alone. At midnight. I stepped out of the bunk, pulling my hoodie tighter around me. The night air had a bite to it, damp, cool, carrying the distant scent of pine and earth. The sky overhead was clear, stars sharp and bright. I turned on my phone flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path in front of me. The dirt road through camp was wide enough for trucks and maintenance vehicles, lined with trees on both sides. There were streetlights, but they were few and far between, little islands of yellow light spaced just far enough apart that most of the walk would be spent in darkness. At first, it wasn't so bad. The camp was completely silent except for the occasional rustling of wind through the leaves. I kept my pace steady, listening to the crunch of my sneakers on the gravel. But as I moved deeper into the camp, something started gnawing at me. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, something small at first. A growing awareness of just how empty the camp was, how far away I was from anyone else, how quiet it had gotten. My footsteps sounded louder. Too loud. The trees on either side of me seemed to close in a little more. I kept going, trying to shake the unease, but I started noticing things I hadn't thought about before. The road was uneven in places, ruts and dips from rain and old tire tracks. Shadows stretched long and twisted from the trees, moving whenever my flashlight shifted. The wind picked up, and I swore I heard something creak, a loose wooden sign somewhere maybe. I tried not to look at the trees too much. They were dense, packed tightly together, and my flashlight wasn't strong enough to see far into them. Just dark spaces between trunks, shifting in the wind. Then I reached the soccer field. It was an open stretch of land, completely empty, bordered by a low wooden fence. Beyond it, more trees. The field was one of the few places where the sky was fully open, moonlight shining down over the grass. I was halfway past it when I heard something. A sound. A giggle. It wasn't loud. It wasn't right next to me. But it was there, clear, sharp, cutting through the silence. I froze. My brain immediately scrambled for an explanation. Wind. An animal? Something shifting in the trees? It had sounded human. Something about it made my skin crawl. I didn't turn. I didn't look. I just ran. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my breath coming fast and sharp in the cold air. The library wasn't far, but in that moment, it felt like miles. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted, shadows jerking across the ground. The dirt road blurred under my feet. The bunks, the buildings, the trees, everything passed in a rush, nothing fully registering. I didn't stop until I reached the library. The door was unlocked, and I yanked it open, practically stumbling inside. The warmth of the room hit me immediately, the light too bright after the darkness outside. I was breathing hard, my heart still hammering, but I forced myself to walk in casually, like nothing had happened. I didn't mention it to anyone. I stayed for the hangout, laughed at jokes, listened to music, tried to shake the lingering nerves. But when it came time to head back, I wasn't about to make that walk again. One of the teacher's kids had a pickup truck. I asked for a ride back, made up some excuse about being tired, not wanting to walk in the cold. I sat in the passenger seat as we drove through the camp, headlights cutting through the darkness. The road looked different from inside the truck. Smaller, less intimidating. The trees weren't as overwhelming, the open fields just open fields. I tried to tell myself it had been nothing. An animal, a trick of the wind. Maybe someone had been outside, walking to their own bunk. Maybe I had just imagined it. But even now, I still think about that sound. The way it cut through the silence. The way it made my blood run cold. I never saw anything, but I didn't need to. I still think about that night, years later. It wasn't the kind of horror you expect. The kind where you see something impossible, something that forces you to question reality. It wasn't a ghost or a creature, or even a person. It was worse. It was the complete absence of something that should have been there. Something real, something physical. We had all seen the fire. We had built it with our own hands. And then, in an instant, it was gone. It was the middle of autumn when my friends and I decided to go on a weekend camping trip in the Adirondacks. The group consisted of me, my best friend Mark, and two other guys we'd known since college, Jake and Trevor. We had all camped together before, so this wasn't new to us. We weren't survival experts, but we knew the basics: how to set up a tent, how to start a fire, how to navigate in the woods. The place we picked was deep in the forest, far from any designated camping grounds. Mark had found it a few years back while hiking, and he swore it was one of the best spots, totally secluded, with a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. No nearby roads, no trails. Just wilderness. We parked miles away and hiked in with our gear, the late afternoon sun filtering through the thinning leaves. The temperature was perfect, cool but not cold. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. By the time we reached the clearing, the sun was already sinking. It was a beautiful spot, just like Mark had described. The ground was mostly flat, covered in soft earth and fallen leaves. A few thick logs sat around the remains of an old fire pit, left behind by whoever had camped there before. We dropped our packs and got to work setting up. Once the tents were up and our gear was organized, the next priority was a fire. The sun was nearly gone by then, and the temperature had dropped noticeably. We gathered dry branches and twigs, stacking them in the fire pit. Trevor had brought some fire starter sticks, so getting it going was easy. Within minutes, flames flickered to life, crackling and sending up little spirals of smoke. We sat around it, warming our hands, stretching out sore legs. Mark pulled out a small flask of whiskey and took a swig before passing it around. As the night deepened, we relaxed. We cooked some food over the fire, hot dogs, some foil-wrapped potatoes we had buried in the coals. We talked about old stories, joked about stupid things we'd done in college. It was peaceful. The fire was strong, burning bright and steady. We fed it regularly, making sure it wouldn't die down too soon. There was no wind, no rain, perfect conditions for keeping a fire going all night if we wanted to. Eventually, one by one, we started turning in. Trevor was the first to crawl into his tent. Jake followed about half an hour later. Mark and I stayed up the longest, staring into the fire, enjoying the quiet. Around midnight, we finally decided to call it a night. The fire was still burning, the though not as high as before. It would smolder for hours. At worst, it would burn down to glowing embers by morning. Either way, there was no chance it would be gone completely. I crawled into my sleeping bag, closed my eyes, and let the warmth of the fire lull me to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. The inside of my tent was dark, but something felt off. The air was colder than before, and everything seemed unnervingly silent. No crackling fire. No distant hoots of an owl. Just complete stillness. I lay there for a few moments, disoriented. Then I realized I had to pee. Reluctantly, I unzipped my sleeping bag and pulled on my jacket. The cold hit me immediately, sharper than before. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent flap, and stepped out. The clearing was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. My breath came out in a thin mist. I turned my flashlight on, aiming it toward the fire pit, and froze. The fire was gone. Completely gone. Not just burned down. Not just smoldering. It was as if there had never been a fire at all. I took a step closer, my heart hammering. The fire pit was empty. No embers. No ashes. No half-burned logs. Just blackened dirt. I swung the flashlight around, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. No sign of wind. No footprints that weren't ours. Just the empty fire pit. A sudden chill ran down my spine. I turned and hurried to Mark's tent, whispering his name. Mark. Mark, wake up. A few seconds later, his groggy voice responded. What? Get out here. Now. There was some shuffling, then the sound of his tent unzipping. He emerged, squinting against my flashlight beam. What's wrong? I pointed. Look. He followed my gaze to the fire pit. His face shifted from confusion to disbelief. What the hell? He walked over, kneeling beside it. He ran a hand over the dirt. It was cold. This isn't possible, he muttered. It should still be warm at least. I felt a heavy knot forming in my stomach. Where's the wood? The ashes? Mark shook his head. I don't know. This doesn't make sense. We woke Trevor and Jake. They stumbled out, annoyed at first, but when they saw the fire pit, the irritation vanished. You guys are screwing with us, right? Jake said, though his voice lacked conviction. Why the hell would we do that? I snapped. Trevor crouched down, running his fingers through the dirt. It's like we never even had a fire. Silence settled over us. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The woods pressed in around us, the trees like silent watchers. I suddenly had the urge to pack up and leave, but none of us wanted to admit how shaken we were. We'll figure it out in the morning, Mark finally said. Maybe something happened we're not thinking of. None of us believed that. But what else could we do? Reluctantly, we went back to our tents. I lay awake for hours, listening, waiting for something, anything, to explain what had happened. But nothing came. At first light, we got up and examined the site again. The firewood was never found. No charred remains, no burnt-out logs hidden nearby. The ground where the fire had been was ice cold. There was no rational explanation. No wind strong enough to scatter everything. No rain to wash it away. No animals that could have carried it off so completely. We left that morning, cutting the trip short. None of us said much as we packed up. Years later, I still think about that night. I've gone over every possible explanation, but nothing makes sense. The fire was there, and then it wasn't, and I don't know what could have taken it. The woods are never truly silent, not even in the dead of night. I had been camping plenty of times before, and I knew the usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the wind moving through the trees. But this night felt different. We had set up camp deep in a forest that was miles from the nearest town. A group of us, 6 in total, all experienced campers. We weren't idiots. We had checked the weather, packed extra food, made sure our tents were positioned in a safe clearing. There was nothing unusual about the trip, nothing that should have made me uneasy. And yet, as I lay in my tent staring at the ceiling, I felt it. That creeping sensation that something wasn't right. At first, I blamed it on the isolation. We were far out, and that kind of remoteness had a way of playing tricks on the mind. I rolled onto my side, forcing my eyes shut, telling myself it was nothing. Then I heard it. A sound outside. At first, it was faint. Just the snap of a twig. Maybe a raccoon, maybe just the forest settling. I held my breath, listening. Then, clear as day, a laugh. Not a normal laugh. Not something casual or distant. It was high-pitched, sharp, almost shrill. like someone gasping between jagged breaths. A cackle. It sent a cold wave through my body. I sat up, my pulse quickening. I listened again, waiting to hear it repeat. The tent was zipped shut, and I had no intention of opening it to look. I told myself it had to be one of the others. Maybe someone was joking around, trying to freak us out. But it hadn't come from any of our tents. It had been outside, close, just past the tree line. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to come again. It didn't. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down. The forest had fallen into silence. No wind, no rustling, just thick, suffocating stillness. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, the fear felt distant. It was easier to convince myself I had imagined it. Lack of sleep could do that. The others were already gathered around the fire, making coffee, frying up some breakfast. I grabbed my gear and joined them, shoving the night's unease to the back of my mind. We had just started eating when we heard it. A howl. At first, it was distant, a lone voice cutting through the trees, somewhere far out in the forest. Then another. Then another. It was hard to tell how many. Maybe 5, maybe more. The first howl had made us all pause. The second made us look at each other. The third made us realize we were surrounded. The sound was coming from all around us, cutting off any obvious path back to the road. I swallowed, gripping my fork tighter, staring into the trees. Wolves weren't common in this area. Coyotes, maybe. But they didn't behave like this. They didn't move in tight packs. They didn't close in like this. For a moment, nobody moved. The fire crackled. The wind shifted through the branches above. Then another sound. Not a howl. Movement. The underbrush rustling. The snap of branches. The sound of something shifting in the shadows, just beyond our vision. I stood slowly, heart hammering in my chest. The howls had stopped, but now the woods were filled with something worse. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that made my skin crawl. Something was out there. No, not just something. Many things. Waiting. Watching. The feeling of being hunted is not something you forget. We weren't just in the woods anymore. We were in something's territory. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering. We needed to move. Needed to pack up, get out, do something other than just sit there waiting. But before we could react, the silence broke. Not with a howl. Not with movement. With another laugh. The same sharp, jagged cackle from the night before. Not from one of us. Not from the woods. From behind one of the tents. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed my pack, threw it over my shoulder, and moved. The others didn't need to be told twice. We left the fire, left the food, left whatever the hell was lurking in the trees. We walked fast, then faster, then finally broke into a full sprint when we heard something. Something big, moving through the brush behind us. We didn't stop. Not even when we heard another laugh echo through the trees. We didn't look back. We just ran. It took nearly an hour before we made it back to the road. The forest behind us was still. But I swear, just before we piled into the car, I heard it again. A single, distant cackle. And I knew whatever was out there, it had let us go. This time. I used to camp alone in the woods. I wasn't supposed to, but no one could really stop me. It was peaceful. Something about being out there, away from everything, made the world feel smaller, simpler. No lights, no roads, no hum of distant traffic. Just me, the trees, and the night. It was never about survival. I wasn't out there building shelters from scratch or rubbing sticks together to make a fire. I brought what I needed, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small gas stove. Just enough to be comfortable, nothing more. I knew the woods well, and I wasn't scared of the dark. Or at least, I hadn't been. The last time I went camping alone, I saw something I still can't explain. I wasn't alone after that, not really. People told me I wasn't allowed to go anymore, that I was at risk. At risk of what, exactly? I don't know. Maybe I don't want to know. That night, I set up camp in a familiar clearing, deep enough in the woods that I wouldn't run into anyone, but not so far that I couldn't make it back easily. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, the air was cool but not cold, and the sky was clear enough that the moonlight made everything glow a pale silver. I set up my small tent, unpacked my bag, and got everything arranged the way I liked it. The routine was familiar, comforting. By the time I finished, the last light of the sun had faded from the sky, and the world was blue-black and quiet. I made a small meal, sat against a fallen log, and listened to the woods. It was peaceful, like it always was. I didn't have a fire. I never did. Fires drew attention, and I didn't want to be seen. After eating, I walked a little. Not far, just to stretch my legs, to listen. The night was completely still, no wind moving through the branches, no rustling in the undergrowth. It felt like the woods were waiting. That's when I saw it. It was far away, at the edge of the field beyond the trees. A figure, moving slowly across the open ground. I stopped. The figure wasn't walking. It wasn't running. It was floating. It was dark against the pale grass, a tall, human-like shape that drifted, smooth and silent, across the field. There was no sound, no footsteps, no rustling of clothing. It moved in a straight line, steady and unbroken, as if it was gliding on an invisible rail. I stared, my mind scrambling for an explanation. A trick of the light? A person on a hoverboard? One of those self-balancing things people had for about a month before they all disappeared? I stood frozen, waiting to see where it would go, if it would slow, stop, turn. It didn't. It just kept moving, perfectly level, until it reached the far side of the field and disappeared behind a line of trees. I didn't breathe for a long time. Then I moved. Fast. I pushed through the undergrowth, branches snapping under my boots, my heart hammering. I needed to see. I needed to know what it was. When I reached the edge of the field, I stopped. The moon was bright, the open ground silver and empty. No footprints. No tracks. No one. I scanned the far side, expecting to see movement in the trees, a figure disappearing between the trunks, but there was nothing. Just the woods, silent and still. I forced myself to step forward, to cross the field, to check the place where it had vanished. There was nothing there. No path, no signs of movement. No broken branches, no scuffed dirt, nothing to suggest that anyone, had passed through. The woods were too quiet. No wind, no insects, just silence. A weight settled in my stomach. I turned and walked back to my camp. I didn't run, but I wanted to. When I reached my tent, I stopped outside, staring at the fabric. It suddenly felt too small, too thin. A flimsy layer of nylon between me and whatever else was out there. I didn't sleep that night. I sat inside my tent, my back against my pack, listening. Waiting. I left at first light. People said the woods were haunted. I never believed it. Still don't. But I know what I saw. And I know I won't be going back. I had always enjoyed hiking alone. Something about the solitude, the rhythm of my own footsteps, the crisp air filling my lungs. It gave me a sense of peace I rarely found elsewhere. This time, I had chosen a remote trail in the Great Smoky Mountains, one that wasn't particularly well known. It wasn't on any major maps, but a few experienced hikers had mentioned it in forums. They described it as quiet, overgrown, and a little challenging, but incredibly scenic. That sounded perfect to me. I set out early, just after sunrise, my backpack snug against my shoulders. The trail started as a narrow dirt path winding through dense forest, the morning light filtering through the thick canopy above. Birds chirped and squirrels rustled in the undergrowth. The air smelled fresh, a mix of damp earth and pine. I had checked the weather before leaving. Clear skies, cool temperatures, no sign of rain. Ideal conditions. I planned to hike about 12 miles to a small clearing by a stream where I'd set up camp for the night. Then, I'd hike back the next morning. It wasn't a particularly long trip, but the solitude and challenge were what I craved. The first few hours passed uneventfully. I made good time, stopping only to drink water or adjust my pack. The trail was rough in places, fallen logs, thick brush, and roots twisting up from the dirt, but nothing I couldn't handle. It was around midday when I first noticed it. That creeping sensation, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. I paused, listening. The forest was still. Too still. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, no distant animal calls. Just silence. The kind that presses in on you, heavy and unnatural. I turned, scanning the trees behind me. Nothing. Just tall, unmoving trunks stretching in every direction. Shaking off the feeling, I pressed on, convincing myself it was just my imagination. I was alone out here. An hour later, I heard it. Footsteps. Not the quick, skittering movement of a deer or a squirrel. These were slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze mid-step, listening. The sound had come from behind me, just off the trail. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. Nothing. The trees stood silent, thick shadows stretching between them. The undergrowth looked undisturbed. But I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my own footsteps echoing. There had been a second set. A chill crept over me, but I forced myself to keep moving. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, and I still had miles to go before I reached my campsite. The logical part of my brain told me it was just an animal. A black bear, maybe, or a coyote. But I didn't fully believe that. By late afternoon, I was exhausted. The uneven terrain had slowed me down, and I had to take more breaks than I planned. But I was close, less than a mile from my campsite. I could hear the faint sound of water in the distance, the stream I'd be camping beside. Then, as I rounded a bend in the trail, I saw it. A figure. It was standing deep in the trees, partially hidden by the undergrowth. My brain struggled to process what I was looking at. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, human-shaped, unmoving. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat. It was gone. The spot where it had been was empty now, just the same dense forest as before. Had I imagined it? My pulse pounded in my ears. I took a slow step forward, then another. My eyes darted from tree to tree, searching for movement. But there was nothing, just silence. A part of me wanted to turn around, to hike back to my car and forget about camping for the night. But the more stubborn part of me, the part that didn't want to admit fear, pushed forward. I reached the clearing just before sunset. The stream was exactly as I had pictured, wide, shallow, flowing gently over smooth stones. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease crawling up my spine. I forced myself through the motions of setting up camp. Tent first, then gathering firewood. I built a small fire, just enough for warmth and light. I made dinner, dehydrated camping food, barely edible but filling. As darkness settled over the forest, my surroundings faded into blackness beyond the firelight. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see something standing just at the edge of the light. But there was nothing. Just as I was starting to convince myself I had imagined everything, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, measured, circling my camp. I gripped my flashlight, pointing it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, but all I saw were trees. No movement. The footsteps stopped. I sat there, barely breathing. My mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another hiker? A poacher? Someone lost. But why wouldn't they call out? Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself into my tent, zipping it shut. I kept my knife within reach, my ears straining for any sound. I must have drifted off at some point, because when I opened my eyes, it was early morning. Pale light filtered through the fabric of my tent. The fire had burned down to cold ash. For a brief moment, I almost convinced myself it had all been in my head, until I stepped outside. There, just beyond the extinguished fire, was a footprint. A single, clear print in the dirt. Human. Barefoot. It was large, the toes slightly curled into the earth as if whoever, or whatever, had been standing there had been watching me sleep. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. I didn't pack up my gear. I didn't eat breakfast. I just grabbed my essentials, shoved them into my pack, and left everything else behind. I hiked back faster than I ever had before, my legs burning, my heart pounding. I didn't stop. Not for water, not for rest. I didn't look back. Only when I reached my car, locking the doors behind me, did I finally let myself breathe. I never told anyone the full story. Not my family, not my friends. I just said I had a weird feeling and left early. I never went back for the rest of my gear. I still go hiking, still enjoy the solitude, but I don't camp alone anymore. And every so often, when I'm out on a trail and the forest goes quiet, I remember that night. Because whatever was out there, it wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. Camping on the South Downs was something we did all the time. It wasn't an official campsite or anything, just a patch of woods we knew well. There was something about being out there, away from everything, with nothing but the trees and the night, that made it feel like we had our own world. We didn't need tents or campfires, just some old sleeping bags and a tarp strung between trees to keep off any rain. This was one of those summer nights where the air was warm, the sky was clear, and the moon was so bright it might as well have been a street lamp. There were 10 of us that night. We'd set up in a clearing, the trees surrounding us like the walls of a room. No one had brought much food, just some crisps, a few sandwiches, and a couple bottles of cheap cider. It wasn't about eating. It was about being out there, messing around, and doing whatever we wanted with no one to tell us otherwise. At around 1 a.m., I got the urge to walk. Not far, just into the trees a little, stretch my legs. Two of my friends, Liam and Chris, decided to come with me. We didn't take anything, just the phones in our pockets. The moon was bright enough that we didn't really need torches. The woods looked different at night, the silver light giving everything a sharp, unreal quality. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and the further we walked, the more the sounds of our group faded away until it was just us and the quiet. We moved in single file along a narrow path, our footsteps barely making a sound against the dirt. The night air was completely still. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Unlike other parts of the world, the bugs in England don't make much noise at night, so it was eerily silent. That's when we saw the glow through the trees. At first, it was just a flicker of orange between the trunks, like the ember of a cigarette, but as we got closer, we saw it was a fire. A campfire. Not small, either. It was big enough to send dancing shadows up into the branches above it. The firelight made the figures around it look strange, their faces lit from below, casting deep shadows across their features. They had a few large tents set up behind them, proper ones, the kind you'd bring for a long stay. They weren't kids like us either. They were adults. We stopped. I don't know why we didn't notice them sooner. Maybe it was the way the terrain dipped slightly, or the fact that they weren't making much noise either. We were close, too close. A thin screen of bushes stood between us and them, and we hadn't been seen. We crouched low, barely breathing. There was something about stumbling upon another group like this that felt off. We weren't supposed to be here. Not that we were trespassing, but there was an unspoken rule about these kinds of places. When you camp somewhere unofficial, it feels like yours, like you're the only ones out there. Seeing another group doing the same thing shattered that illusion. Through a mix of hand signals and quiet whispers, we decided to mess with them. It was stupid, but we were 16, and it felt like the perfect opportunity. Liam was the first to make a sound. He could drop his voice unnaturally low, and when he let out a long, slow "come here," it cut through the night like something straight out of a horror film. The moment he finished, I screamed. Not just any scream, but a high, terrified, gut-wrenching shriek. I poured everything into it, making it sound as real as possible. A desperate, human sound, like someone was being dragged into the trees against their will. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. The kind of scream that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. Then we ran. We didn't wait for a reaction. We didn't look back. We slipped away into the dark, using nothing but the moonlight to guide us. I don't remember if I heard anything behind us, if they shouted, if they ran, if they even reacted at all. My heart was pounding too hard, and all I could focus on was moving. By the time we got back to our camp, we were out of breath but buzzing with adrenaline. The others could tell something had happened, but we didn't tell them right away. We just collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard, laughing under our breath. Eventually, we told them. They thought it was hilarious, but after a while, the excitement died down. The idea of another group being out there stuck in my head. We weren't as alone as we thought. For a long time, I just lay there staring up at the sky, listening. Not just to our own sounds, but to everything else. The woods had changed. They felt different now, like something was awake that wasn't before. I kept expecting to hear footsteps approaching, or distant voices in the dark. I kept wondering what they thought had happened, if they thought someone was really out there, hurt and screaming for help. I never knew if they came looking. If they walked through the trees with torches, scanning the darkness, trying to find the source of that awful sound. I never knew if they packed up and left, or if they stayed, pretending it hadn't happened, hoping it wouldn't happen again. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined what it must have been like to be them, sitting around their fire, when that voice came out of the trees. And then the scream. I wonder if they ever camped there again. I was 16 the first time I camped alone. I'd been on plenty of trips with my family before, up to our property in northern Michigan. But this was different. This time, it was just me and our dog, Duke. Duke was a chow and black lab mix, built like a small bear, thick fur, broad chest, strong legs. He was the kind of dog people crossed the street to avoid, but in reality, he was mild-mannered, almost lazy. Nothing ever seemed to bother him. He'd nap through thunderstorms, barely lift his head when strangers came by, and let little kids crawl all over him without a fuss. He wasn't a watchdog, at least not in the way you'd expect a big dog to be. He was just there. Solid, dependable, a quiet presence. That's why what happened on the second night out there scared the hell out of me. The property was about 40 acres of dense northern woods, pine, oak, thick underbrush, and no clear trails. There was an old logging road that cut through it, mostly overgrown, but still drivable with a high-clearance vehicle. I had taken my dad's truck as far in as I could go before unloading my gear and hiking the rest of the way to a small clearing we always used for camping. It was nothing special, just a flat spot with an old fire ring made of rocks and some logs arranged around it. I set up my tent near the tree line, close enough for some wind cover, but not so close that branches would scrape against the nylon. Duke wandered around, sniffing at things, tail wagging lazily. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles, and there was the constant background noise of insects and birds. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get when you're far away from everything. By late afternoon, I had everything set up, tent staked down, firewood gathered, food stored in a cooler a safe distance from camp. I sat by the fire, ate a sandwich, and watched the sunset bleed orange and purple through the trees. Duke lay beside me, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air before settling back down. When darkness set in, the forest came alive in a different way. Crickets, owls, the occasional rustle of something moving through the brush. I wasn't scared, at least not yet. I grew up in these woods. I knew what was out here. Deer, raccoons, maybe the occasional black bear, but nothing that would come looking for trouble. That first night passed without incident. I zipped into my sleeping bag, Duke curled up near my feet, and I slept soundly. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning hiking around, marking trails with bits of cloth so I wouldn't get turned around. Duke trotted beside me, panting happily. In the afternoon, I fished at a small stream on the edge of the property, cooked up what I caught, and let the rest of the day pass in easy silence. As night fell, I banked the fire and crawled into the tent. Duke followed, circling twice before flopping down near the entrance. I was half asleep when I noticed he was restless. He kept shifting, lifting his head, ears twitching. His tail thumped against the ground a few times before he went still. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because when I woke up, everything was different. Duke was standing. Not just standing, he was rigid, ears pinned back, body tense. His teeth were bared, and the lowest, deepest growl I'd ever heard was rolling out of him. So deep I could feel the vibration in my chest. I froze. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, circling the tent. Not the quick, light steps of a deer, not the rustling, chaotic movement of a raccoon. These were slow, steady, unmistakably human. Duke tracked the sound, turning his head in a slow, controlled movement, his growl never stopping. My heart pounded so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I reached out, fumbling blindly for my flashlight. My fingers closed around it, but I didn't dare turn it on. Something exhaled just outside the tent. A sharp, heavy breath. Not an animal. Not something small. I held my breath. Duke's growl stayed constant, his body shifting slightly as he followed whatever it was moving outside. He did a full rotation, nose up, hackles bristling, muscles bunched. Then he stopped. His entire body locked onto the tent flap. Whatever was out there was standing right in front of it. I gripped the flashlight so hard my knuckles ached. I wanted to turn it on, to do something, but fear kept me frozen. The breathing was closer now. Deep, steady. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Duke stayed locked in position, but the growl slowly faded. Minutes passed. I couldn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, Duke sat down. He didn't relax completely. His ears stayed up, his eyes never left the entrance, but the tension in his body lessened slightly. Whatever had been outside was gone. But we didn't sleep. I sat there with Duke, staring at the entrance, my heart still hammering. Every small sound made my skin crawl. The wind rustled the trees. A branch cracked somewhere in the distance, but there were no more footsteps. As soon as the first light of dawn seeped through the trees, I moved. I packed up camp in record time, shoving everything into my bag without care. Duke stayed close, still on edge, eyes darting around. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out. The hike back to the truck was the longest of my life. Every noise made me flinch. Duke stayed ahead of me, ears swiveling, posture tense. It wasn't until we reached the truck that he finally shook himself out, let out a huge breath, and wagged his tail. I didn't look back as I drove away. I don't know what was out there that night. A person. Maybe. Some drifter passing through. Or someone who didn't want to be seen. But it wasn't an animal. and it wasn't my imagination. Duke never reacted like that to anything before or after that night. I never camped alone there again. I had been camping alone for years. It wasn't something I thought twice about. Remote spots, places deep in the backcountry where I wouldn't see another soul for days, that was my usual preference. This place, compared to some of the places I'd been, wasn't even that far out. A few hours from the city, a free camping spot along a river, complete with a fire pit and a beat-up old picnic table. It was the kind of spot locals probably used during the summer, but in the fall, with the cold creeping in and the days getting shorter, it was empty. That was why I picked it. The drive-in was uneventful. A long stretch of highway, then onto gravel roads, weaving deeper into the forest. The further I drove, the quieter it got. The usual signs of civilization, houses, fences, power lines, disappeared. The only thing left was endless trees, the occasional glimpse of the river, and the crunch of gravel under my tires. By the time I reached the site, the sun was already lowering behind the tree line. The spot was as expected, flat ground, the fire pit made from large stones, and the picnic table, weathered and cracked from years of exposure. The river ran just a short distance away, its surface calm, reflecting the colors of the trees that lined the banks. It was quiet, except for the occasional gust of wind and the distant sound of the water moving over rocks. I got to work setting up camp. Tent first, staked down tightly in case the wind picked up. Sleeping bag unrolled, gear organized. I set up my cooking stove on the picnic table, made a quick meal, and sat there eating while the last bit of daylight faded. It should have been relaxing, but it wasn't. I've spent enough nights alone in the woods to know the difference between normal quiet and something else. This was something else. I wasn't hearing anything strange, no snapping twigs, no movement in the underbrush, but something felt off. A kind of pressure in the air, a stillness that didn't feel right. It made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. At first, I tried to shake it off. It was probably just my brain reacting to the isolation, the way it sometimes does when you spend too much time alone in the woods. I kept telling myself that, but the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I found myself looking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the tree line, listening for something, anything, that might explain why I was on edge. But there was nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees, the occasional sound of the river shifting against the rocks. I finished eating, put out the fire, and decided to turn in early. The feeling didn't go away inside the tent. If anything, it got worse. The thin walls of nylon felt useless, like they weren't enough to keep whatever was out there away from me. I wasn't tired, but I forced myself to lay down, zipped into my sleeping bag, and turned on a podcast on my speaker. Something familiar, a voice to fill the silence. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember waking up. The first thing I noticed was the cold. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the air inside the tent was crisp. The second thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Too quiet. The uneasy feeling from the night before was gone, but in its place was something else. A kind of awareness, a feeling that something had changed. I unzipped the tent and crawled out. The sun was barely over the horizon, the light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows across the ground. The river was calm, a thin layer of mist hovering over the surface. Everything looked normal, until I turned toward the picnic table. That's when I saw it. A hat, sitting on the table, right in the middle of the wooden planks. It wasn't mine. I knew for a fact it hadn't been there the day before. I had set my stove on that table, had sat there eating dinner, had gone through my gear. If that hat had been there, I would have seen it. But now here it was. A worn baseball cap, dark in color, the fabric faded and creased from use. I stared at it for a long time, my brain trying to make sense of it. There were only a few possibilities. Someone had been in my camp during the night. That someone had left the hat there. I had slept through all of it. I looked around, scanning the ground for footprints, any sign that someone had walked through my camp. The dirt was disturbed, but that didn't mean much. The wind, the way the light played with the shadows, it was hard to tell if anything was different. I didn't touch the hat. I didn't want to. The thought of someone being that close to me, while I slept, made my stomach turn. I started packing up immediately. I didn't bother making coffee, didn't bother eating. I moved quickly, stuffing gear into my pack, breaking down the tent, securing everything in the truck. Every few minutes, I looked up, scanning the trees, checking the shadows. I still didn't hear anything. When I was finally ready to leave, I hesitated. I looked at the hat one last time. Then I got in my truck and drove away. I've gone over that night in my head more times than I can count. The feeling I had, the uneasy, creeping sensation that I was being watched, I don't think it was in my head. I think someone was there. A hunter, a hiker, a mushroom picker maybe. Someone moving through the woods, maybe looking for a place to sleep, maybe just passing through. But that doesn't explain why they left the hat. It wasn't dropped. It was placed, right in the center of the table, where I would see it. I don't know why, and I don't want to. I've camped alone since then, plenty of times, but I've never gone back to that spot. The whole idea to go camping that night wasn't really planned. It was one of those last-minute decisions that didn't make a lot of sense, but we went through with it anyway. My dad, my sister, and I had been talking about getting out into the woods for a while, and I guess that night, something made my dad decide it was finally time. The problem was it had rained all day, non-stop, and the ground was completely soaked. On top of that, we didn't even leave the house until it was already getting dark. By the time we drove out to the spot, it was pitch black. The only light we had was from the car's headlights and our flashlights, which barely did anything in the thick woods. The rain had stopped, but everything was dripping wet, and the air was heavy and damp. The kind of damp that clings to your clothes and makes everything feel colder than it actually is. I remember stepping out of the car and immediately feeling weird. It wasn't like I thought something was out there watching us. Not exactly, but there was just this unsettling feeling that made me keep looking over my shoulder. The sound of water dripping from the trees filled the air, along with the occasional rustling from something moving through the wet underbrush. Probably just small animals, but in the dark, every sound felt amplified. Setting up the tent was a nightmare. The ground was soft and muddy, and every time we tried to push a stake in, it either slid right back out or got stuck in a tangle of roots. We fumbled around for what felt like forever, struggling with the poles and the rain-soaked fabric. The air smelled like wet leaves and damp earth, and every few minutes, a gust of wind would shake the trees, making them drop more cold water down on us. Eventually, we got the tent up, though it wasn't great. The ground underneath was lumpy and wet, and the inside of the tent felt damp just from all the moisture in the air. But we were tired, and at that point, it didn't really matter. We crawled inside, zipped up the door, and settled in for the night. I laid down in my sleeping bag, but I couldn't relax. That weird feeling was still nagging at me, like an itch in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. I kept listening to the woods outside, hearing the occasional snap of a twig or the rustle of something moving in the distance. My dad and my sister seemed fine, though. My dad was already breathing slow and steady, like he was dozing off, and my sister wasn't saying anything either. I tried to tell myself I was just being paranoid, that the sounds I was hearing were normal forest noises. But as I lay there, half awake, half asleep, I swore I heard footsteps. Not just rustling in the underbrush, but actual, deliberate steps. Slow, heavy, moving somewhere nearby. I wanted to sit up, but my body felt weighed down by exhaustion. My eyelids kept drooping, and my brain kept slipping in and out of consciousness. The last thing I remember before I fully started drifting off was hearing those faint, steady steps, like something was walking just beyond the tent. Then suddenly my dad shot upright. It was so fast, so sudden, it startled me awake. The way he sat up wasn't normal. It was like something out of a horror movie, like his body had just snapped up on its own. My heart jumped, and I turned my head slowly to look at him, confused, still groggy from sleep. Then I heard it. Heavy footsteps. Right outside the tent. Close. And then the low, guttural sound of something grunting. I felt a jolt of fear, so strong it made my whole body tense up. My breath caught in my throat, and for a second I couldn't move. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what I was hearing, but the only thought that kept repeating in my head was, something is out there. Right outside. Something big. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was deathly silent. The kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, making every tiny noise seem deafening. Then my dad yelled, "Get out of here." His voice was loud, commanding, full of authority and fear at the same time. The kind of yell that was meant to scare something off. But instead of running, whatever was outside made a sound that sent pure terror through me. A deep, throaty growl. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close to human. It was low and rumbling, filled with something that sounded more like anger than fear. And then, Before I could even process what was happening, the entire side of the tent caved in. Something huge had hit it. Hard. I heard fabric tearing. The whole tent shook violently, and for a second, I thought it was going to collapse on top of us. I could hear the sound of something massive shifting outside, the crunch of leaves, and the heavy exhale of an animal breathing. I didn't even breathe. None of us did. We just sat there, frozen, too scared to make a sound, too scared to even move. Seconds passed. Then a minute. Then another. The only thing I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, so loud it drowned out everything else. My dad hadn't moved since he yelled, and my sister was completely still, probably holding her breath just like I was. Then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, we heard it moving away. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating into the darkness, fading into the distance. We waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Maybe more. No one wanted to unzip the tent to see what was on the other side. Eventually, my dad moved first. He slowly reached out, unzipped the door just a crack, and peered outside with the flashlight. I could see his hand shaking as he held it up, scanning the area. The ground was torn up. Mud was disturbed, leaves scattered. The side of the tent where it had been hit had deep gashes in the fabric, long slashes where something had ripped through it. We didn't sleep after that. None of us did. We sat there in silence for the rest of the night, listening, waiting, afraid that whatever it was might come back. At first light, we packed up everything as fast as we could. We barely talked. My dad kept looking around, scanning the trees, checking the ground for tracks. When we finally got back to the car, I remember looking back at the tent one last time, seeing those torn-up holes in the fabric, proof that it really happened. And even though we were safe, even though we were getting out of there, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us that whole night. I don't know why I walked into the woods alone that night. Looking back, it was stupid. But at the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. It was a scout event, one of the biggest I'd been to, with at least 1,000 people spread across the campsite. Fires dotted the clearing, tents packed tightly together in neat rows, and the sound of laughter and conversation carried through the trees. It should have felt safe, but it was Belanglo. The name itself carried weight. Everyone knew what had happened there. The backpacker murders. 7 bodies dumped in the forest, left to decay among the trees. Some of them had been there for years before they were found. People talked about it in hushed voices around the campfires, their faces lit by the flickering glow. Some laughed it off, made jokes. Others stayed quiet, listening. I didn't think about any of that when I stepped away from the group that night. I just had to pee. The toilets were busy, a long queue of people waiting, shifting from foot to foot, talking quietly under the cold night sky. I didn't feel like standing there. It was late, I was tired, and the woods were right there. Just a few steps away. No big deal. So I walked in. The air changed the second I left the clearing. The noise of the camp faded behind me, muffled by the thick trunks of the pine trees. The ground was soft, damp from the recent rain, and the smell of wet earth filled my nose. I took a few more steps, far enough that no one would see me, then stopped. The night was quiet. Too quiet. The moment I unzipped my pants, I felt it. That creeping sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just darkness stretching out in all directions, broken only by the pale glow of the moon filtering through the branches. I took a breath, shook off the nerves. It was just my imagination. I had to be thinking about the murders, the stories, the fear that clung to this place. That was all. Then I looked down. The first thing I saw was white. Small, jagged pieces scattered across the damp earth. More than just a few. Dozens. No, hundreds. Bones. My breath caught in my throat. My body froze. For 5 long seconds, I couldn't move. Couldn't think. My brain refused to process what I was looking at. They were everywhere. Sticking up through the moss, half buried in the dirt. Some long and straight, others twisted and broken. I could see ribs, vertebrae, something that looked like a jawbone. My chest tightened. My vision blurred. Human. The word slammed into my brain like a hammer. I was standing in the middle of a field of bones. Alone. In Belanglo. I forced my eyes to focus, to really see. The shapes, the textures. The way the bones were scattered, random, careless. My breath came fast and shallow, heart pounding against my ribs. Then something shifted. A small detail. but enough to crack through the fear. They weren't human. I exhaled a shuddering, uneven breath. My hands were shaking. I blinked, trying to slow my heartbeat, trying to make sense of it. Animal bones. I could see it now. The shape of a skull, too long and narrow. The size of the leg bones, too small. Some kind of deer, maybe. Wild dogs. Something not human. My knees nearly gave out. It was fine. It was fine. I had scared myself for nothing. The tension in my chest loosened, but only slightly. My mind was still racing, my body still wired with adrenaline, because the fear didn't really go away. It wasn't the bones that scared me anymore. It was the fact that they were there. Someone, or something, had brought them here. Left them in this spot. Scattered them like this. I swallowed, my throat dry. The trees pressed in around me, the silence heavier than before. I wasn't supposed to be here. Slowly, I took a step back. Then another. Careful not to disturb anything, not to make a sound. My body was screaming at me to run, to turn and bolt back to the camp, but I forced myself to move slow, deliberate. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it was stronger now. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. My breath came fast, too loud in the quiet. I took another step, and a branch snapped somewhere behind me. The sound was sharp, crisp, like a gunshot in the stillness. I stopped breathing. For a long, terrible moment, I just stood there. Then, carefully, I turned my head. Nothing but darkness. The trees stood still, unmoving. The wind had died down. But I knew. Someone else was out there. I could feel them. They weren't moving, not yet. Just waiting. Watching. My pulse hammered in my ears. My mouth was dry. I had to get out of there. I forced my legs to move. Steady steps, slow, trying not to make noise, even though every instinct was screaming at me to run. Step. 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 Another crunch behind me. Closer. My stomach twisted. My breath hitched. I moved faster. I could see the faint glow of the camp through the trees now. Distant but close enough. Almost there. Another step. And then, something moved. Not just a sound this time. A shape. A shadow shifting between the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. I ran. Bolted for the camp, crashing through the underbrush, feet slipping in the damp earth. My heartbeat pounded in my skull, my breath ragged and uneven. The light got closer. The voices, the fires. I broke through the tree line, stumbled into the open, gasping for air. The noise of the camp surrounded me, normal, safe. People laughing, talking, completely unaware. I turned back to the woods. The darkness stared back. Nothing moved. No sound. No sign of anyone there. But I knew what I had felt. I stood there for a long time, breathing hard, heart still racing. Then slowly, I walked back to my tent. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, but I didn't sleep that night. Camping alone in the backwoods of southern Mississippi wasn't the smartest thing I'd ever done, but it was something I had wanted to do for a long time. I had always loved the woods, the solitude, the feeling of being completely removed from the rest of the world. The thick forests, the humid air, the smell of damp earth, it all felt like a reset from the noise of everyday life. I had chosen a spot far off any well-marked trails, a clearing near a slow-moving bayou. It was deep in gator country, but I figured if I was careful and stayed aware, I'd be fine. The water was dark, full of floating debris, and thick with the smell of rotting vegetation. Cypress trees loomed over it, their roots twisting up from the muck like skeletal fingers. Spanish moss hung heavy from their branches, barely swaying in the still, oppressive air. I had arrived late in the afternoon, set up my small one-person tent in the middle of the clearing, and built a fire. The woods were alive with sound. The distant croaks of bullfrogs, the occasional splash of something moving in the water, the high-pitched chirps of insects that never seemed to stop. I made a simple meal over the fire, ate quickly, and sat back against a fallen log, watching the flames flicker and listening to the night around me. At some point, exhaustion took over. The heat and humidity made everything feel sluggish, and with nothing else to do, I decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my tent, zipped the flap shut, and laid back on my sleeping pad. The air inside was stifling, but I was too tired to care. I must have drifted off quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a sound that sent ice through my veins. A low, rumbling growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Deep, guttural, something alive and massive. It vibrated through the air, steady and relentless. I stayed completely still, my heartbeat slamming in my chest. It didn't stop. The growl rolled on, deep and primal, like the sound of something barely holding back a much more violent noise. It wasn't a dog. It wasn't a bear. It was something heavier, something ancient. The woods felt different now, charged with an energy I hadn't noticed before. The frogs had gone silent. The insects had stopped. The only sound in the night was that long, steady growl. I stayed frozen, my body refusing to move. I could feel sweat dripping down my back, pooling in the fabric of my sleeping bag. My breathing was shallow, barely there. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay still, to not make a sound, to let whatever was out there pass. But the growl didn't pass. It stayed, constant and unwavering, vibrating through the ground beneath me. Finally, after what felt like forever, I forced myself to move. Slowly, painfully slowly, I reached toward the zipper of my tent. I barely touched it, moving it just enough to create the smallest opening. I pressed my eye against the gap and peered outside. I almost wished I hadn't. In the center of my campsite, bathed in the dim glow of the dying fire, were two enormous alligators. And they were mating. I had seen gators before. I had watched them from a safe distance, sunning themselves on riverbanks, gliding through the water with barely a ripple. But I had never seen them like this. The male was massive, his dark, armored body nearly the length of my tent. His head was broad, his mouth slightly open, revealing rows of yellowed, jagged teeth. His tail flexed, sending dirt and pine needles scattering. His growl hadn't stopped. It was coming from deep in his throat, vibrating his entire body. The female was slightly smaller, her scales glistening in the firelight, her own low growls mixing with his. They were tangled together in the dirt, rolling, tails lashing, bodies slamming against the ground. The sound of their scales scraping together was sickening, like stone grinding against stone. Their bodies shifted, jaws snapping, growls deepening. The male's growl would rise in pitch, then drop back down, the vibration of it rattling in my chest even from inside the tent. I was trapped. I couldn't move. I couldn't run. If they rolled the wrong way, they could crush my tent without even realizing it. If they got spooked, if they became aggressive, there was nothing between me and them but a thin layer of nylon and air. I had never felt fear like this before. It wasn't just the fear of an immediate threat. It was the helplessness of knowing there was absolutely nothing I could do. If they turned on me, if they decided I was in the way, it would be over before I could even think about reacting. I laid there for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing, every muscle locked in place. I could hear the deep huff of their breathing, the scrape of their claws against the dirt. The male's tail slapped the ground so hard it sent a shockwave through the earth beneath me. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The male lifted his head, his throat still vibrating with that low, rolling growl. He turned slightly, his dark eyes scanning the clearing, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, his gaze locked onto my tent. I stopped breathing. He was staring directly at me. I could see the firelight reflecting in his eyes, the faint shimmer of movement behind those black, ancient pupils. He exhaled a slow, heavy breath that sent a ripple through his throat. I felt my fingers clench into fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to move. And then, just as slowly, he turned away. With a final, throaty rumble, he shifted his massive body and started toward the bayou. The female followed, moving with a slow, deliberate crawl, her tail sweeping a path through the dirt. They moved as if nothing had happened, as if they had never been there at all. I waited until the sounds of the swamp came back, the distant croaks of frogs, the buzz of insects, before I allowed myself to move. My arms were trembling as I unzipped the tent fully and sat up, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. My body felt numb, stiff with fear. I looked around the clearing. The dirt was churned up, the remnants of their struggle marked in deep grooves and scattered leaves. The fire had almost completely died out, casting only the faintest orange glow over the disturbed ground. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in my tent, back pressed against the fabric, gripping my knife even though I knew it would have been useless against something that size. Every tiny sound made my heart jump. As soon as the sky began to lighten, I packed my gear in record time, stuffing everything into my backpack without caring if it was neat. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just moved, my legs carrying me as fast as they could through the trees, back toward my truck, away from whatever had unfolded in that clearing the night before. When I finally reached my truck, my hands were still shaking. I threw my gear into the back, slid into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a long time, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror, my face pale, my eyes wide. Eventually, I started the engine and pulled away, leaving the campsite behind. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. I had spent years planning this trip, a solo bicycle journey across the western United States, spanning roughly 5,300 miles over 7 months. The idea of riding through vast, open landscapes, sleeping under the stars, and waking up to the sounds of nature had always called to me. I wanted to disconnect from the noise of daily life and embrace the raw beauty of the wilderness. Unlike most long-distance cyclists, I wasn't interested in staying at campgrounds or motels along the way. My plan was simple: wild camping. Each night, I would find a secluded patch of land far from any road or town, pitch my tent, and drift off to sleep surrounded by nature. It was an approach that saved money, but more importantly, it made me feel like I was truly out there, alone, self-reliant, and free. The first few weeks went exactly as I had hoped. I cycled through endless plains, dense forests, and quiet mountain roads. The days were grueling, with miles of pedaling under the hot sun, but the nights were peaceful. I quickly fell into a rhythm: ride, eat, set up camp, and sleep. The sounds of crickets, owls, and rustling leaves became familiar, even comforting. But that changed one night in western Montana. I had been riding all day through a remote stretch of forest, where the road was barely more than a dirt path winding between towering pines. As the sun dipped low, I knew I needed to find a place to camp. I spotted a small clearing just off the road, nestled between the trees. A narrow stream trickled nearby, its sound soft and steady. It seemed perfect. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal on my small stove, and stretched out to rest. As I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the darkening sky, I noticed something. Silence. Not the usual quiet of the wilderness, but a total, unnatural absence of sound. No crickets, no wind, no rustling branches. I sat up, suddenly alert. My breath was the only thing I could hear. Then, just beyond the edge of the clearing, a twig snapped. I froze. I knew what twigs sounded like when a squirrel or rabbit moved through the underbrush. Light, rapid, almost insignificant. But this sound was different. It was sharp, deliberate, heavy. Someone or something was out there. I reached for my flashlight, slowly unzipping the tent. As I shone the beam into the trees, nothing moved. The forest stood still, like a frozen photograph. My pulse hammered in my ears. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the exhaustion from the day had made me paranoid. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed awake for hours, listening. The silence never broke. The next morning, I packed up quickly, eager to leave that place behind. As I rode away, a strange sense of relief washed over me, like I had just escaped something I couldn't explain. I pushed hard that day, covering nearly 80 miles before stopping for the night. I found a new campsite deep in the woods, far from any sign of civilization. The silence from the previous night still lingered in my mind, but I forced myself to believe it was nothing. That evening, as I sat near my tent eating dinner, I saw him. A man, standing in the trees about 50 yards away. He wasn't moving, just standing there, partially hidden behind a trunk. Watching me, a wave of cold fear ran through me. I wanted to call out, to demand to know what he was doing out here, but something in my gut told me not to. Instead, I stared back, gripping my knife with white-knuckled fingers. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the forest. I didn't sleep that night. A month later, I had made my way into southern Washington. The days were getting shorter, the air cooler. The exhaustion of the journey was catching up to me, but I pushed on. Then one night I got sick. It started with a stomachache, then nausea. Within hours, I was vomiting violently outside my tent, my body racked with chills. I knew dehydration was a real danger. I had enough water for another day or two, but I was weak. The nearest town was 30 miles away. Under normal conditions, I could ride there in a few hours. But now, it felt impossible. As I lay in my tent, curled up in misery, I heard something outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. Then the fabric moved. Something, or someone, was touching the side of my tent, pressing against it as if testing the material. I swallowed the scream rising in my throat. Then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the pressure vanished. The footsteps moved away. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. I just lay there, listening, waiting for whatever was out there to come back. By morning, I knew I had to leave. Weak and dizzy, I forced myself to pack up my gear. My legs trembled as I climbed onto my bike, every push of the pedals a struggle. I had barely made it a mile when I saw him. The same man, standing at the edge of the road, watching me pass. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pedaled harder, pushing my exhausted body to the limit. I rode for hours, only stopping when I reached the safety of a small motel on the outskirts of town. That night, I locked my door and wedged a chair under the handle. I didn't care if I was being paranoid. I never wild camped again. I finished my journey months later, reaching my final destination in California. But something had changed in me. I had always loved the silence of nature, the stillness, the solitude. But now I feared it, because I knew, somewhere in the deep, empty woods of the American West, something was out there, watching, waiting, and it had let me go. This time. I've been hunting in northern Minnesota since I was a teenager. My father taught me how to track deer, read the wind, and respect the woods. He always told me that the forest holds secrets, things you might not understand, things you don't want to stumble upon. I never truly grasped what he meant until the day I found the body. It was late October, that perfect time of year when the air is crisp, the leaves are mostly down, and the deer start moving more as they prepare for winter. I had planned this trip for weeks. Work had been draining me, and I needed the solitude. Just me, my rifle, and the stillness of the woods. I woke before dawn, brewed a quick pot of coffee on my propane stove, and double-checked my gear. The cabin I stayed in was an old hunting shack deep in the forest, about 2 miles from the nearest road. Isolated, but that's the way I liked it. The nearest town was 30 miles away. By 5:30 a.m., I was hiking to my usual stand, a sturdy wooden platform built between 2 thick oaks near a well-worn deer trail. The stars were still out, and my breath came in soft clouds in the cold morning air. The forest was alive with sound, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. I reached my stand and climbed up, settling in for the long wait. The forest slowly woke around me as the sky brightened. Birds called, squirrels chattered, and I listened intently for the rustle of a deer moving through the trees. But the woods were too quiet. Hours passed. Not a single sign of movement. No deer. No small game. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. By noon, my stomach was growling, so I decided to stretch my legs. Sometimes a slow walk can stir something up, a deer bedded down, a fresh set of tracks. I climbed down and moved carefully, rifle slung over my shoulder, keeping my steps light. That's when I smelled it. It started as a faint odor, something barely noticeable beneath the crisp autumn air. At first, I thought it was just the scent of damp earth, maybe an old carcass left behind by coyotes. But as I walked, the smell grew stronger. It was the unmistakable stench of death. I've smelled dead animals before. Deer that had been gutted and left too long, raccoons rotting in the heat. This was different. It was heavier, thicker, almost sweet in the worst possible way. A deep unease settled in my gut, but my curiosity got the better of me. I moved toward the smell, rifle ready, every sense on high alert. The forest felt wrong, the silence oppressive. Then I saw it, a disturbed patch of earth beneath a thick stand of pine trees. The ground looked like it had been recently dug up and then hastily covered again. Flies buzzed frantically above the soil, a black cloud of wings and movement. And then I saw what had been exposed. A hand, pale, bloated, fingers curled slightly as if in a final grasp. The skin was tinged with blue and purple, the nails cracked and dirt-stained. My stomach lurched. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. My mind raced. Had someone been buried here? How long ago? And most disturbing of all, who had done it? Then a sound. A branch snapping. Close. Too close. I wasn't alone. A chill crawled up my spine, every hair on my body standing on end. My fingers tightened on my rifle as I slowly turned my head, scanning the trees. Nothing. But I felt it. That unmistakable sensation of being watched. The smell of death was suffocating now, thick and cloying, sticking to the back of my throat. My instincts screamed at me to leave. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. Then another. The forest remained silent. I forced myself to move carefully, not wanting to draw attention. My heart pounded against my ribs. Then I heard it again. A crunch. A shuffle. Someone was there. I couldn't see them, but they were there, hiding in the trees, watching me. I turned and started walking, keeping my pace steady. Not running. Running would make me a target. Running would make them chase me. The scent of death clung to my clothes, the taste of it thick in my mouth. I could feel eyes on me the entire way back to my stand. My hands were shaking as I climbed the ladder, heart hammering against my ribs. I forced myself to sit, rifle in my lap, scanning the woods below. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Then 2. Nothing. The forest remained unnervingly still. I should have left. I should have packed up, hiked back to my cabin, and driven straight to the sheriff's office. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid. That maybe it was an old grave, something from years ago. Maybe an accident. Maybe just some hunter who got lost and never made it out. But deep down, I knew better. When the sun began to set, I climbed down, moving quickly. The hike back to my cabin felt longer than usual. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow stretched too long. I reached my cabin, bolted the door, and sat in silence, gripping my rifle. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something outside. A soft crunch of leaves. A faint breath against the window. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to be stupid. I packed up my gear and started the long hike back to my truck. I would report what I found, let the authorities handle it. But when I reached my stand, I froze. The ground beneath the trees, the disturbed patch of earth where I had seen the hand, was untouched. The flies were gone. The smell of death had vanished. The soil looked undisturbed, as if no one had ever been buried there. My breath came in short, panicked gasps. I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had smelled. But it was gone. And then, just as I was about to turn away, a sound, a whisper, low, barely audible, drifting through the trees. Leave. I ran. I didn't care about noise. I didn't care about anything except getting the hell out of there. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove straight to the nearest town, to the sheriff's office. I told them everything. They searched, sent a team out. They found nothing. No grave, no body, no tracks, nothing. The sheriff gave me a long, unreadable look and told me to stay out of the woods for a while. Said sometimes the forest plays tricks on people. I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. And I know that someone was out there, watching. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. But sometimes late at night, when the wind shifts just right, I swear I can still catch a whiff of that terrible, rotting scent. And I know, someone is still out there, waiting, watching, hiding in the trees. I've never been the type to scare easily. I've spent countless nights alone in the woods, camping, hunting, just enjoying the solitude. Something about being surrounded by nature, away from the endless hum of civilization, has always been calming to me. But what happened that night at my uncle's cabin changed the way I see the woods. It was the summer of last year, late July. My uncle owns a small, off-grid cabin in West Virginia, tucked deep into the Monongahela National Forest. No electricity, no running water, just a wood stove, a hand-pumped well, and a lantern-lit porch. I'd been up there plenty of times before, sometimes with family, sometimes alone. This trip, I was alone. I had driven in that morning, parked at the edge of the rough dirt trail leading up to the cabin, and hiked the last half-mile in. It was humid, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, but the cabin was cool inside, shaded by a thick canopy of trees. I spent most of the day gathering firewood, setting up my gear, and making sure everything was in order. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some beans over the fire, sat on the porch with a beer, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustling of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Then the second night came. I woke up late that morning, feeling well-rested. The day was uneventful. I fished for a bit in the creek down the hill, cooked a simple dinner, and watched the sun dip below the trees. As darkness fell, I noticed something strange. Fog. It rolled in quickly, far faster than I had ever seen before. One moment, the woods were clear, and the next, thick tendrils of mist were snaking through the trees, creeping up the hillside, swallowing the path back toward my truck. Within minutes, the visibility had dropped to almost nothing. I could barely see 10 feet beyond the porch. I told myself it was normal. Fog happens, especially in the mountains. The air had been humid, and the temperature was dropping. Simple science. But the way it moved unsettled me. It didn't drift like normal fog. It pulsed, shifting in slow waves, as if something were pushing it forward from deep within the trees. The sounds of the forest faded with it. The crickets stopped chirping. The usual rustling in the underbrush went silent. Even the distant hoots of the owls ceased. A heavy stillness settled over the woods. I told myself it was nothing. I wasn't a child, afraid of the dark. I went inside, bolted the door, and settled into my sleeping bag on the old wooden cot. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the sheer, suffocating silence pressing in from outside. But I knew something was wrong the moment I opened my eyes. The lantern had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. The fog outside was thicker than before, pressing right up against the cabin like a living thing. I sat up, listening, and that's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just outside the cabin. My first thought was that it had to be a bear. Black bears were common in this part of West Virginia, and though they usually avoided humans, a curious one might come sniffing around. Then I heard the crunch of boots on gravel. Not a bear. A person. I moved silently, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and reached for my rifle. It was propped against the wall near the door. I took slow, steady breaths, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped near the porch. I waited. Then, through the small window beside the door, I saw him. A tall figure, just beyond the porch steps, standing perfectly still in the thick fog. I couldn't make out his face, just the silhouette. He was wearing dark clothing, his posture unnaturally rigid. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, just standing there, watching. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I've dealt with trespassers before. Occasionally, hikers wandered too far off the marked trails, and sometimes, poachers showed up in the area. But something about this man felt wrong. I raised the rifle, not aiming directly at him yet, but ready. Who's there? Silence. Hey, I called louder this time. You're on private property. You need to leave. Nothing. He just stood there, motionless. A long moment passed. Then, without a sound, he stepped back into the fog. One step, then another, and then he was gone. The fog swallowed him whole. I didn't move for what felt like hours, straining my ears for any sound, any hint of movement in the trees. Nothing. The silence was complete. The fog was so thick outside that even the dim glow of the moon couldn't penetrate it. I locked every window, bolted the door, and kept my rifle close. Sleep was out of the question. At some point in the night, I heard something again. Not footsteps this time, something lighter. A tap. A single, deliberate tap against the window. My throat went dry. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. The window was completely fogged over from the outside. But there, right in the center, was the unmistakable impression of a handprint. A human hand, pressed against the glass. I stayed frozen, my grip on the rifle tightening. My breathing was shallow, my pulse thudding in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. After what felt like an eternity, the handprint faded, vanishing back into the fog. But I knew he was still out there, watching. I don't remember falling asleep. But at some point, exhaustion must have won out because I jolted awake to the sound of birds chirping. Sunlight streamed through the window. The fog was gone. I hesitated before unbolting the door, rifle still in hand. The ground outside was damp, the dirt soft. I stepped onto the porch, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Then I looked down. Boot prints, leading from the trees to the porch, circling the cabin, stopping at the window. But there were no prints leading away. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there had disappeared without a trace. I packed up and left that morning, hiking back to my truck with my rifle in hand, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The entire time, I felt like I was being watched. I told my uncle what happened. He just nodded, like he had heard something similar before. I haven't been back since, and I don't think I ever will. I don't usually hike alone, but that day, I needed to clear my head. Work had been a nightmare. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing with emails, and I just wanted to be somewhere quiet. So I packed my bag, drove out to the Olympic National Forest, and started hiking a lesser-known trail I'd heard about from a coworker. It wasn't an official route, but it was supposed to be beautiful. Thick evergreens, soft moss-covered ground, and barely a soul in sight. Perfect. I had the whole day ahead of me, so I took my time, breathing in the clean air and listening to the occasional rustle of small animals darting through the underbrush. The weather was ideal, cool, cloudy, the kind of day where the mist settles between the trees like something out of a dream. After about 2 hours of hiking, the trail narrowed, winding deeper into the forest. The trees were massive here, their trunks thick and ancient, their roots twisting out of the ground like gnarled fingers. Some had hollowed out sections at their bases, big enough to crouch inside. I'd always been fascinated by trees like that. It made me wonder what animals had taken shelter in them over the years, what secrets the forest might be hiding. That's when I saw it. A giant, dead tree, standing alone in a small clearing. It was different from the others. Its bark was dark, almost blackened, and a massive hollow gaped near its base, big enough for a person to crawl into. Something about it made me pause. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. I stepped closer, my boots sinking into the damp earth. The hollow was pitch black inside, and a faint, musty smell drifted out. It smelled like rot, but not fresh rot, something old, something forgotten. I flicked on my flashlight and aimed it inside. At first, I saw nothing but damp wood and dirt. Then something caught my eye. A bundle of fabric, tucked deep within the hollow. My heart kicked up a beat. My brain immediately started rationalizing. Maybe someone had used it as a hiding place. Maybe it was just trash, left behind by a careless camper. But something about the way it was shoved inside, hidden, made my stomach twist. I stepped closer, crouching down to get a better look. The fabric was stiff, weathered, and as I reached in to pull it out, something heavy shifted inside. The skull tumbled out first. I barely had time to react before it hit the ground with a dull, hollow thud. A human skull. I froze, my breath stuck in my throat. The world around me seemed to tilt, my vision narrowing on the yellowed bone at my feet. Empty sockets stared up at me. The jaw was missing, but there was no mistaking what it was. I stumbled back, my hand trembling as I swung the flashlight deeper into the hollow. More bones. A lot more. I scrambled to my feet, my pulse hammering in my ears. The silence of the forest pressed in, thick and heavy. Suddenly, the trees didn't feel comforting anymore. They felt like walls trapping me. Someone had put these bones here. Someone had hidden them. I spun around, scanning the trees. Was someone watching me right now? I listened, really listened, but all I heard was my own ragged breathing. No birds, no rustling leaves. Nothing. The stillness was suffocating. I had to get out of there. I pulled out my phone, my hands still shaking. No service. Of course. I looked back at the hollow tree, my mind racing. Should I take something as proof? A bone. The fabric. Every part of me screamed that I needed to get away. Now. But some stubborn part of my brain told me I had to bring something back, something to show the police. I forced myself to reach down, grabbing the fabric bundle with both hands. It was heavier than I expected, and as I lifted it, something metal clinked inside. I hesitated, then unwrapped it. A knife. Old, rusted, the handle wrapped in what looked like leather. There were dark stains on the blade, but I didn't let myself think about what they might be. I shoved the knife into my bag, then turned and ran. The forest that had felt peaceful just hours ago now felt endless, suffocating. Every shadow felt like a person. Every snap of a twig made me flinch. I followed the trail as fast as I could, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The whole time, I kept expecting to hear footsteps behind me, but I didn't. The silence was worse. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. By the time I reached my car, my hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys. I forced myself to take deep breaths, my head pounding with adrenaline. I didn't look back at the trail. I didn't want to see if someone was standing there. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. The officer on duty listened as I tried to explain what I'd found, my words tumbling over each other. I pulled the knife from my bag and placed it on the desk. He stared at it for a long moment before picking it up with gloved hands. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. I told him everything. The tree, the bones, the feeling of being watched. He nodded, then picked up his radio. "We'll send someone out." I thought that would be it. I thought I'd done my part. But then he looked back at me, his face unreadable. "You said the bones were inside the tree?" "Yeah. And they looked old?" I nodded. The officer was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a thick folder. He flipped through it before stopping on a page and turning it toward me. It was a missing persons report. The photo was grainy, but I recognized the man's face immediately. He had been missing for 12 years. The next day, the police went out to investigate. They found the bones, just like I said, but there was something I didn't expect. The tree had been disturbed. The hole was deeper, the soil freshly moved. As if someone had been there recently. As if someone had been watching me. They never found out who put the bones there. They never found out who the knife belonged to. But sometimes, I still dream about that tree. And when I wake up, I swear I can still smell the rot. Camping in the Smoky Mountains had always been on my bucket list. Dense forests, rolling mist over the hills, and miles of unspoiled wilderness. It was the perfect escape. I had been on plenty of hiking and camping trips before, but this one was different. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away, a quick break from our daily lives. Instead, it became something none of us would ever forget. There were 4 of us, me, Mark, Daniel, and Chris. We had planned this trip for weeks, carefully choosing a remote campsite based on coordinates we found in an old online forum. The location was supposed to be pristine, far from the usual campgrounds, untouched by crowds, and with a perfect view of the valley below. We left early on a Friday morning, packed light, and hiked deep into the backcountry. The trail was steep and winding, cutting through dense forest. Birds called from the treetops, and the distant sound of rushing water echoed through the trees. It felt like we were stepping into another world, far from civilization. But somewhere along the way, we must have made a wrong turn. By the time we reached what we thought was our campsite, something felt off. The clearing was there, just as the map had shown, but the landscape didn't match the pictures we had seen online. The trees here were different, older, twisted, with thick vines hanging low. The ground was uneven, scattered with strange, weathered stones, half buried in the dirt. "We definitely took a wrong turn," Daniel muttered, pulling out his GPS. He frowned. "I don't have service. Anybody else?" No one did. We were too deep in the forest. Mark shrugged. "Looks good enough to me. We're not hiking all the way back just to find a different spot." Chris hesitated, glancing around. "It just feels weird." "It's fine," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll set up camp, stay the night, and if it still feels off in the morning, we'll head back." We unpacked our gear, set up our tents, and got a fire going as the sun dipped below the trees. The temperature dropped quickly, and soon the forest was bathed in a dim, eerie twilight. The wind moved through the branches, making the trees creak and groan. That's when the noises started. At first, it was just the occasional rustling in the underbrush, which wasn't unusual. Small animals were always moving around at night. But as the hours passed, the sounds became more deliberate. Twigs snapped in rhythmic intervals. Leaves crunched in patterns, circling us. I locked eyes with Mark across the fire. He heard it too. "Could be deer," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. We listened for a while, the fire crackling between us. But the sounds didn't stop. In fact, they grew closer. Then, just after midnight, we heard the voice. It was faint, distant. A woman's voice calling out, "Help!" The 4 of us froze. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air, but none of us moved. Chris was the first to break the silence. "Did you hear that?" We all nodded. "Maybe someone's lost," Daniel said, grabbing his flashlight. Mark and I exchanged glances. There was something wrong about the voice. It was too soft, too strained. "We should check it out," Chris said, already standing. "I don't think that's a good idea," I said quickly. Mark agreed. "If someone's really lost, they'll keep calling out. If we go looking for them now, we could get lost too." Daniel hesitated. "But what if they need help?" We listened, straining to hear. The woods had gone completely silent. No insects. No wind. Nothing. Then the voice again. Closer. "Help." It sent a chill down my spine. Mark swallowed. "It sounds exactly the same as before." He was right. The same tone, the same weakness in the voice. Like a recording playing on loop. That was when I knew. This wasn't a lost hiker. Chris, still holding his flashlight, aimed it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trunks and twisted branches. He hesitated, then turned the light off. "We stay here," I said firmly. "No one leaves the campsite." No one argued. The voice didn't call out again, but the sounds returned. The rustling, the snapping branches. They continued for hours, surrounding us, moving closer, then retreating. None of us slept. We sat by the fire, gripping our knives and hatchets, watching the darkness. The forest felt alive, like something was breathing just beyond our sight. By dawn, the noises had stopped. The moment the first light touched the treetops, the woods seemed normal again, almost like nothing had happened. But as we packed up to leave, Chris suddenly stiffened. "Wait, where's my knife?" We turned, scanning the campsite. His knife had been right next to him all night, but now it was gone. Then we noticed something else. The stones, those old, half-buried ones, had been moved. They now formed a perfect circle around our fire pit. None of us had touched them. We left without a word, hiking back faster than we ever had before. We never figured out where we had camped that night. When we checked the GPS later, the coordinates led to a blank space on the map. No trails, no clearings, nothing. It was as if that place didn't exist. None of us ever went back. I had been planning the canoe trip for months. A solo journey through the Adirondacks, just me, the river, and the quiet of the wilderness. It was exactly what I needed, a break from everything. No phone, no emails, no noise. Just the sound of the paddle dipping into the water, the rustling trees, the occasional call of a loon in the distance. I had done trips like this before, though never completely alone. This time, I wanted the solitude. I wanted to prove to myself that I could handle it, that I didn't need anyone else out here. I had my gear, tent, food, water filtration system, maps, compass. Everything I needed to stay safe. The first day was perfect. The water was calm, the sky clear, the air crisp with early autumn coolness. The leaves were just beginning to turn, their reds and oranges reflecting off the water in shimmering patches. I paddled for hours, my arms working in a steady rhythm. No schedule, no destination beyond the vague plan to follow the river north and make camp somewhere along the shore when I felt like stopping. By mid-afternoon, I found a small, rocky bank that looked like a good place to set up. It was flat enough for my tent, close enough to the water for convenience, but far enough from the trees to avoid falling branches in the night. I pulled my canoe ashore, unloaded my gear, and set up camp. The whole process took less than an hour. Afterward, I made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat on a fallen log, watching the river darken as the sun sank behind the trees. That first night, I slept deeply. The exhaustion from paddling had drained me, and the steady sound of the water lapping at the shore was soothing. Nothing disturbed me. No strange noises, no rustling in the trees beyond the occasional breeze. When I woke up, the sky was still streaked with pink, the air damp and cool. I packed up quickly, eager to get back on the water. The second day was much like the first. Long stretches of quiet paddling, the occasional pause to watch a heron lift from the shallows or to let the current carry me as I drank from my canteen. By afternoon, I had covered a good distance. The river widened, the banks growing steeper, lined with jagged rocks and dense forest. It was here, in this more remote stretch, that I noticed the first strange thing. I had stopped paddling for a moment, letting the canoe drift as I adjusted my grip on the oar. That's when I saw the ripples. They were small at first, just subtle rings in the water about 20 feet ahead of me. I figured it was a fish or maybe a turtle surfacing. But as I watched, the ripples continued, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. They weren't random like the splash of a fish or the lazy drift of a floating branch. They were steady, moving toward me. I tightened my grip on the paddle, my stomach tensing. It was probably nothing. Maybe a beaver swimming beneath the surface, its movements sending small waves outward. But something about the way it moved unsettled me. I decided to keep going. I dipped the paddle back into the water, steering the canoe to the side, trying to avoid the ripples. But as I moved, so did they, always staying the same distance ahead of me. I told myself I was imagining it. The water plays tricks sometimes. I had read about it before, how currents and temperature shifts can create patterns that look unnatural. Still, I paddled harder, wanting to put distance between myself and whatever was making those ripples. They followed. Not fast, not aggressively. Just keeping pace. By late afternoon, I was on edge. The ripples had disappeared for a while, and I told myself I had been overreacting. But the feeling of unease lingered. I needed to find a campsite soon, somewhere safe, somewhere where I could put up a fire and get some distance from the water. That's when I saw the clearing. It was a small, flat patch of land just off a bend in the river, bordered by a dense wall of trees. A good spot, elevated enough that I wouldn't have to worry about flooding, close enough to the water that I could keep my canoe within reach. I pulled ashore, dragged my canoe onto the rocky bank, and set up my tent. By the time the fire was going, the sun had dipped below the treeline, turning the sky a dull gray. I ate quickly, my eyes flicking toward the river more often than I liked. It was too quiet. The usual nighttime sounds were there, the chirping of insects, the occasional rustle in the trees, but the river itself seemed still. Too still. Then the ripples came back. I saw them just past the light of the fire, moving in slow, steady circles. Closer this time. I stared, frozen. I had no reason to be afraid. I was on land, my fire burning bright, my canoe secured. But something in my gut told me to stay alert. And then I saw it. A hand, just beneath the surface. Pale, motionless, fingers barely visible through the dark water. I jumped to my feet, my breath catching in my throat. The fire crackled beside me, casting flickering shadows across the ground. I stepped closer to the shore, my heart hammering. But when I looked again, it was gone. The ripples were still there, spreading outward, but the hand, if I had even seen it, had vanished. I backed away from the shore, forcing myself to breathe. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. The human brain is wired to see patterns, to find familiar shapes in the unfamiliar. It had to be a trick of the water, of the light. That night, I barely slept. Every rustle, every creak of the trees had me jerking awake. More than once, I swore I heard the sound of water moving. Soft, deliberate, like someone wading through the shallows. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I could handle discomfort, but this was something else. Something deeper. I didn't belong here. I packed up quickly, shoving everything into my canoe with clumsy hands. I pushed off, the boat rocking as I paddled hard, wanting to put distance between myself and that campsite. The river was calm. Too calm. I paddled faster. And then the ripples came back. Right next to my canoe. I glanced down, dread curling in my stomach. The water was dark, reflecting the overcast sky. But beneath the surface, just for a second, I saw it again. The hand, rising, fingers stretching toward me. I didn't scream. I didn't look twice. I just paddled, harder than I ever had in my life. My arms burned, my breath came in ragged gasps, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I didn't slow down until I reached a wider stretch of river, where I knew there were campsites with other people. When I finally pulled ashore, shaking, I looked back at the water. It was still, empty, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew I would never, ever come back.